What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What If I Were Reborn in Smallville as Clark Kent? The Future Superman. Part 2. If you enjoy this type of content, please super smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. Let's dive into the rise of Superman without further ado. Clark left the store at super speed, running through the streets of Smallville, intangible and invisible. He passed through walls and buildings as if they were air, moving without anyone noticing his presence. His destination was Sean's house, where he knew he'd find him relaxed, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Sean was in his room, lying on his bed, idly scrolling through his phone, suspecting nothing. Clark knew this was the perfect moment to act. Clark entered Sean's house unnoticed, phasing through the walls with ease. Once he reached the bedroom, he positioned himself beside Sean's bed, still invisible. He watched him for a brief moment before making his move. Whoosh! With a quick motion, Clark became visible and materialized in front of Sean. Before the boy could react, Clark grabbed him by the arm, lifting him off the bed effortlessly. "What's going on? Clark, let me go!" Sean shouted, frightened, struggling to free himself. But it was useless. "You're coming with me," Clark said, his voice cold and determined, as he carried Sean at super speed out of the house. Within seconds, they arrived at the antique shop where Tina was waiting. Clark entered the shop with Sean, who was still trying to fight back but to no avail. Tina, still in the form of Sean, stood up when she saw them enter, a satisfied smile on her face. Clark looked directly at Tina. "Here he is. Now I need to transfer some of his memories to you." Tina nodded eagerly, watching as Clark approached Sean. Clark placed his hand on Sean's head and slowly began accessing his memories. He quickly sifted through Sean's thoughts, from important moments with his family to close friends and personal preferences. It was crucial that Tina knew exactly how to behave without raising suspicion. Whoosh! The transfer was quick, and Tina, now armed with the necessary knowledge, smiled, fully prepared to take over Sean's life. "Now you know everything you need. Do it right," Clark said, releasing Sean for a moment to take his documents. Sean, still dazed, looked around in despair, but he didn't have time to react. Clark grabbed him again, turned intangible, and descended with him into the basement of the antique shop. The environment was dark and damp, far from prying eyes. Clark looked at Sean one last time before finishing the situation. He made sure he had the documents in his possession, ensuring everything would go according to plan. "This is the end for you, Sean. Your existence will be replaced by something more useful," Clark said coldly, disappearing into the depths of the basement, leaving Sean completely at the mercy of fate. When Clark returned to the surface, Tina, still in Sean's form, was ready to proceed with the plan. "Now go," Clark ordered, "and make sure no one suspects anything." Tina nodded, satisfied and confident in her new identity, as she prepared to leave the antique shop and live Sean's life with all the memories and information Clark had given her. "Now I need to take care of another part of the plan," Clark muttered to himself as he headed toward Tina's bag, which was hidden in the antique shop. Clark picked up the bag, quickly checking the contents before closing it. "That's a lot of money." Clark left the antique shop with the bag full of money slung over his shoulder, walking calmly down the street. Clark opened the door to his truck and tossed the bag into the back seat. Vroom! The engine of the truck roared softly as he drove toward the farm. Clark maintained a serene expression, though his mind was full of plans. He needed to ensure everything was under control, including hiding the stolen money. When he arrived at the farm, Clark parked the truck, grabbing the bag from the back seat, and walked toward the barn, making sure to remain quiet. Clark entered the barn, ensuring he was alone. Then he focused, making both his body and the bag intangible. Effortlessly, he phased through the floor of the barn, sinking into the earth below. The dark and silent underground seemed like the perfect place to hide something as valuable as the stolen money. "Perfect," he murmured to himself, slowly re-emerging at the surface and solidifying his body once again. Then, he calmly walked out of the barn as if nothing had happened. When he entered the house, Martha was in the kitchen, handling some dishes, but she turned as soon as she heard the door open. "Clark, you took a while. Did you get the lamp?" Clark shook his head, keeping a calm expression. "No, Mom. The antique shop was closed when I got there. No one showed up, so I'll try again tomorrow." Martha frowned for a moment, but soon relaxed. "All right, dear. Just don't forget. I was really counting on it." Clark gave a slight smile and nodded. "I promise I'll get it as soon as I can." As Martha returned to organizing the kitchen, Clark headed upstairs. Later that same day, at the Kent farm, the sound of a car approaching echoed through the driveway. Vroom. Jonathan, who was sitting on the porch, frowned as he saw Lex's car pull up. Martha, beside him, sighed softly, already sensing her husband's discomfort. "Lex again." Jonathan murmured, crossing his arms. Martha, as always, tried to remain diplomatic. "Give him a chance, Jonathan. Lex might be trying to distance himself from his father's shadow." Before Jonathan could respond, Lex had already stepped out of the car and was climbing the porch steps with his characteristic smile. Clark, who was upstairs, quickly descended the stairs upon hearing Lex's arrival. "Good evening, Lex. What brings you here?" Clark asked, trying to keep a friendly tone. Lex smiled, but his eyes went directly to Clark, showing some concern. "I just wanted to check on you, Clark. The last time we talked, you hung up a bit quickly. You seemed worried about something." Clark shrugged, maintaining his relaxed posture. "Sorry about that, Lex. I had to take care of a few things quickly, but everything's under control now." Lex observed Clark for a moment, as if trying to catch something more in his words, but soon changed the subject. "Actually, I also wanted to talk to your parents about a proposal I have in mind." Jonathan frowned, clearly suspicious. "Proposal?" "Yes," Lex replied, turning to Martha and Jonathan. "I've been thinking about investing in some farms in the area, modernizing them, making farming more competitive, and perhaps increasing production. I know you're traditional, but I wanted to offer the opportunity to modernize the Kent farm." Jonathan shook his head slowly, visibly uncomfortable with the idea. "Lex, I appreciate your offer, but this farm has been in our family for generations. We don't need modernization to keep things running." Martha, on the other hand, seemed more open to the conversation. "Jonathan, maybe we should at least consider what Lex has to say. We don't need to make any decisions now." Lex nodded, realizing that Martha was his biggest ally in the discussion. "Of course, I'm not expecting an immediate answer. I just want you to know that the offer is on the table. If you want to discuss it more, I'm always available." Jonathan, clearly uncomfortable, sighed. "We'll think about it. But I'm not promising anything." Lex gave a small smile and stood up. "That's fine, Jonathan. I don't want to force anything. But I hope you'll consider it. It could be a great opportunity." Martha smiled politely. "Thank you, Lex. We'll talk it over and get back to you." Clark, sensing the tension in the air, walked Lex to his car while Jonathan and Martha remained on the porch. "Sorry about my dad, Lex," Clark said with an apologetic smile. "He's not exactly a fan of the Luthers. Actually, it's more about your father." Lex shrugged, seemingly unbothered. "It's all right, Clark. If I were him, I probably wouldn't trust a Luther either." The two stopped beside Lex's car, and he gave a mysterious smile. "Keep an eye on tomorrow's paper. There's going to be a surprise that I think will interest you." "Surprise? Now I won't be able to sleep from all the curiosity," Clark joked, keeping a casual tone, but his mind was already racing. Lex chuckled softly, opening the car door. "It'll be worth it." Clark watched Lex get into the car, but before he closed the door, Clark quickly focused, activating his mind-reading ability. He knew Lex wasn't completely transparent, and something about this surprise piqued his curiosity. Lex's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts about business, numbers, and a newspaper headline. Article about a promising new author. Clark Kent. Book published by Luther's publishing house. Tomorrow's paper would feature a story highlighting the book release, a move that would give major visibility both to Clark and Lex's new publishing venture. So that's the surprise, Clark thought. Lex rolled down the window. See you later, Clark. I hope you like the surprise. I'll be watching, Clark replied with a controlled smile, waving as Lex drove off. Vroom. The sound of Lex's car fading into the night blended with the quiet of the farm as Clark stood at the entrance of the house, watching until the car disappeared in the distance. Looks like my name is about to start circulating, and very soon, Clark thought, before calmly walking back into the house. Clark stood at the entrance of the house for a few more moments, looking out into the horizon as the sound of Lex's car faded into the distance. He climbed the porch steps calmly, his expression a bit more serious now. Martha and Jonathan were talking, but when Clark approached, they turned to him, sensing that something important was about to be said. Dad, Mom, I need to tell you something. Martha, always attuned to her son's mood, leaned forward slightly, with a curious look. Jonathan, on the other hand, crossed his arms, waiting for what was coming. What is it, Clark? Martha asked softly, already anticipating that there was something more serious at play. I wrote a book. Clark finally broke the silence on the porch. Martha's eyes widened in surprise, and a smile slowly formed on her lips. A book? Oh, Clark, that's amazing. When did you have time to write a book, son? And why didn't you tell us before? Jonathan asked, clearly surprised, his brow furrowing. I wanted to tell you, Dad, but things happen fast, Clark explained. Lex helped me publish the book through his company, and tomorrow an article about the release will be in the paper. Lex? So you've been working with Lex on this project without telling us? Jonathan continued, his voice full of concern. Dad, I just wanted to do something for myself, Clark said, trying to stay calm. I trust Lex to handle the publishing part. I needed this opportunity. I always knew you had talent for so many things. Writing a book is a wonderful achievement. Martha exclaimed, her face lighting up with pride. Yes, but working with Lex without telling us? You know how complicated he can be, Jonathan said, clearly bothered. I don't like the idea of you getting involved in the Luthor's business. I understand your concern, Dad, Clark said, looking directly at Jonathan. But I made this decision because I believe in the project. If this is your dream, son, I'll support you, Jonathan said, sighing and shaking his head. Just be careful with Lex. I promise I'll be careful, Clark responded, a relieved smile appearing on his face. We're very proud of you, Clark, Martha added, giving her son a hug. This book is just the beginning of what you can achieve. Thanks, Mom, Clark said, smiling as he felt the support from his parents. With that, the weight of the conversation lifted, and the evening on the Kent farm porch became lighter. The next day, Clark arrived at the Smallville Convalescent Center. The place was quiet, with few visitors in the morning. A light breeze rustled the leaves of the surrounding trees as he walked toward the entrance. As Clark walked down the silent hallway, his phone began to vibrate in his pocket. Bzzz. Bzzz. He pulled out his phone and saw Chloe's name on the screen. Clark sighed before answering the call. You didn't even tell me there was going to be an article about your book. Chloe exclaimed the moment Clark picked up. I only saw it when I got to school. And you didn't say anything. How could you choose today of all days to do your community service? I know, Chloe, Clark said, trying to stay calm. Things happened quickly, and I wanted to tell you earlier, but I have to do this service today. I promise we'll talk more about it later, okay? You and your excuses, Chloe replied, clearly frustrated but with a hint of humor in her voice. All right, Clark. But only because you're on duty with the elderly today. Exactly, Clark responded, smiling slightly. I'm a responsible citizen, fulfilling my obligation. Whatever you say, Clark. Talk to me later, okay? Chloe said, still a bit annoyed but willing to let the subject drop for now. Will do, Clark said, ending the call. He pocketed his phone and took a deep breath. The truth was, he was trying to handle a few problems ahead of time, and visiting the convalescent center was part of that. Clark walked down the quiet hallway, feeling the calm and peaceful atmosphere of the center. Knock, knock. Clark gently knocked on the door of Harry's room before entering. As the door opened, the room revealed an elderly man sitting in an armchair with a nearly burnt-out cigarette between his trembling fingers. Harry Volk's face was lined with the wrinkles of time, and his gaze was one of pure impatience. "Who are you?" Harry grumbled, not taking his eyes off the cigarette. "If you're here to lecture me about quitting smoking, you can leave. I've heard enough of that for today." Clark stepped inside the room, keeping his tone calm. "I'm Clark Kent. I'm here to help as part of my community service," he said, observing the old man attentively. "I just want to talk for a bit." Harry scoffed, frowning as he flicked the cigarette into the ashtray beside him. "Another one of these volunteer kids," he muttered, unenthused. "You all think you can change the world, but you can barely change your own life." Clark moved closer, unfazed by Harry's words. "You're so old that if you raised your hand to the sky, God would pull you up," Clark said with a sarcastic smile, maintaining his composure. "Funny, huh? Don't think you can impress me with those little jokes, kid," Harry responded, his grumpy tone more evident. "I'm not here to impress anyone, Harry. I just want to help, even if you don't believe that right now," Clark said, his voice soft but firm. Harry rolled his eyes, pulling another cigarette from the pack on the table. "Help? That's what they all say. The world doesn't need help, kid. It's already lost." Clark watched as the old man lit the cigarette with his trembling hands, and a thought quickly passed through his mind. "You may think that, but sometimes help comes in unexpected ways," Clark said, staring intently at Harry. Harry took a drag on the cigarette, barely paying attention, until Clark moved closer and in a nearly imperceptible motion, gently placed his hand on Harry's head. "What are you doing?" Harry grumbled, but his voice became distant as Clark began to use his mental powers. Harry's mind, once agitated and full of vices, began to yield under Clark's control. Clark delicately tampered with Harry's memories, removing any desire for cigarettes and planting a new suggestion, a clear and undeniable command. "You can never go near the lake again. Never." Clark adjusted Harry's memories and behavior, ensuring that when he woke, he would no longer have any desire to smoke and, more importantly, would never approach the lake, where something dangerous could happen. Harry blinked a few times, confused, as Clark slowly removed his hand. What were you saying again, kid?" Harry asked, his mind feeling lighter, though he couldn't identify what had changed. "I was saying that we all have a chance to improve, Harry. And you don't need anything else holding you back," Clark said, giving a small smile. Harry looked at the cigarette in the ashtray, now uninterested in it, something he had never felt before. He extinguished the cigarette without even finishing it. Maybe you're right, kid," Harry murmured, still confused but clearly less grumpy than before. Clark stood up, satisfied with the outcome. One less problem, he thought as he walked toward the door. "I'll come back to see you, Harry." "Take care," Clark said, calmly leaving the room, knowing he had done what he needed to do. Clark walked down the hallway, feeling a sense of control. Now that Harry was out of the way, he could focus on the next steps of his plan. At school, Pete and Chloe were walking together through the halls, chatting excitedly about Clark's book. Both were still surprised that Clark had kept his writing abilities a secret. "So, did you know Clark was writing a book this whole time?" Pete asked, laughing as he looked at Chloe. "I had no clue. How did he hide this from us?" Chloe shook her head, smiling. "Clark can be really secretive when he wants to. But honestly, I'm so proud of him. Publishing a book is a huge accomplishment, even if he didn't tell us beforehand." "I agree. But he's definitely going to have to explain himself when we see him again. This was a huge surprise," Pete said, still chuckling at the situation. As they talked, Jody Melville, a typically shy and quiet classmate, approached with a smile on her face. "Hey Pete," Jody said timidly, waving as she approached. "I was wondering if you'd like to go to Lana's party tonight." Pete raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden invitation, but soon smiled. "Lana's party? I didn't even know she was having one." "Yeah, it's going to be a small gathering, just for a few close friends," Jody explained, looking a bit nervous. "I thought it would be nice if you came." Chloe, standing next to Pete, nudged him slightly, smiling. "Go for it, Pete. Sounds like it'll be fun." Pete glanced at Chloe, who was clearly encouraging him to accept the invitation. He then turned to Jody and smiled back. "Sure, Jody. I'd love to go," Pete said, accepting the invitation. "It'll be great." Jody's face lit up at Pete's response. "Great. See you there, then." She gave a small wave before walking away, leaving Pete and Chloe to continue their conversation. Chloe smiled, clearly happy for Pete. "Looks like you've got a date tonight, Pete." Pete laughed, shaking his head. "I don't know if it's exactly a date, Chloe, but it'll be fun. And who knows what might happen." The two headed to their next classes, with Chloe feeling happy for her friend and excited to see what the night would bring for both of them. Clark walked down the hallway of the convalescence center, his mind focused on his next goal. He had already dealt with the issue of Harry Vogt, but there was still an important matter to address: Cassandra Carver. Clark stopped in front of Cassandra's room, taking a deep breath before lightly knocking. Knock, knock. "Cassandra." Clark called softly as he opened the door. Inside the room, Cassandra was sitting in a chair near the window, her face serene as she gazed outside. Her eyes, though blind, seemed attuned to the world in a way no one could understand. "Who's there?" Cassandra asked, her voice soft but with an unusual clarity. "It's me, Clark," Clark said, approaching slowly. "Clark," she said softly, as if trying to recall. "What brings you to me?" "I came because I heard you have a special ability, Cassandra," Clark replied. Clark moved a little closer, stopping beside her. He knew what needed to be done, but first, he wanted to try something else. I'd like to ask you for a favor," Clark said, hesitating for a moment. "I'd like you to try and see my future." "Your future?" "Clark, the visions I have, they're not always easy to bear. Are you sure you want that?" Cassandra asked, her voice gentle but laced with concern. "Yes, Cassandra. I need to know," Clark replied. Cassandra was silent for a moment, pondering Clark's request. She sighed deeply before extending her hand in his direction, palm open, waiting for him to take it. "If that's what you want, Clark." Cassandra hesitated for a moment before reaching her trembling hand out to his. As soon as their hands touched, Clark watched closely, expecting something to happen. But to his surprise, nothing did. Cassandra furrowed her brow, lightly squeezing his hand as if trying to concentrate. I can't see anything," she murmured, surprised. "That's never happened before. Usually, the visions come instantly." Clark looked at her, realizing that something about her powers wasn't working with him. "Cassandra, it's okay," Clark said calmly, withdrawing his hand. "You don't need to force anything." Cassandra sighed, relaxing a bit. "This is strange, but maybe it's a sign that I shouldn't see your future." Clark nodded, but he had other plans. He knew that as gentle as Cassandra was, her power could be dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. Without saying anything more, Clark extended his hand again and gently placed it on Cassandra's head. "You're going to stop using this power," Clark said, his voice calm but full of authority. "You won't tell anyone about it. You'll forget you can see the future." Cassandra blinked a few times, her body relaxing as Clark's words penetrated her mind. Slowly, she began to accept what he was saying. "I won't use this power anymore," she murmured, her voice distant now, as if resigning herself to what she had just heard. "I'll forget that I can see the future." Clark slowly withdrew his hand, watching as Cassandra remained silent, her mind now molded to forget her abilities. "Thank you, Cassandra," he said with a soft smile. "You're safe now." Cassandra smiled faintly, not knowing why she felt so relieved. Clark stood up, giving her one last look before leaving the room, satisfied that he had dealt with another problem. Clark parked his truck in front of the school, watching as students streamed out of the building. He waited for Chloe, who soon appeared at the entrance, scanning the area until she spotted Clark. She smiled slightly and walked toward him. "So, Mr. Author, are you finally going to tell me about this mysterious book?" Chloe said as she got into the truck, closing the door. Clark smiled slightly as he started the engine. "It was just a hobby. I didn't think it was a big deal." Chloe raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "A hobby? A whole book is just a hobby? Clark, you're hiding your talent." Clark shrugged, keeping his focus on the road as he drove toward the farm. "I just wanted to put some ideas on paper. I didn't think it would go this far." Chloe shook her head, still impressed. "Well, at least now I know why you were so busy these past few months. But, you could have told me earlier." "I wanted it to be a surprise," Clark replied with a mischievous smile. Chloe laughed, shaking her head in disbelief. Well, you definitely succeeded in surprising me. And speaking of surprises, guess who has a date at Lana's party tomorrow night? Clark raised an eyebrow, curious. Who? Pete. Chloe said with an amused grin. He was invited by Jody Melville. It looks like our friend is finally getting some luck. Pete was invited to Lana's party by Jody Melville? Clark asked, raising his eyebrows with a playful expression. Well, good for him. Looks like our friend is finally catching a break. I know, right? Chloe responded, laughing. Who would have thought? Jody's always been a bit shy, but it seems she decided to take the initiative this time. Clark chuckled, still keeping his eyes on the road. Well, good for Pete. He deserves a bit of fun. Chloe nodded, agreeing. Yeah, he does. But let's see how this plays out. Something about Jody seems a little different lately. Jody Melville, huh? I remember her. Great, looks like I'll have to kill my friend's girlfriend, Clark thought, an uneasy feeling forming in his mind. If she becomes a problem, she'll be dealt with, like always. Chloe, unaware of Clark's darker thoughts, continued talking about the party and Pete, excited about the idea of seeing their friend finally getting some romantic luck. But back to your book, Chloe interrupted her own thoughts, returning to the topic that still intrigued her. You never gave me any hints. What's it about? Clark took a deep breath, looking at the road ahead. Meanwhile, at the school, Jody Melville was pacing nervously behind the bleachers, as if waiting for someone. A few minutes later, a student appeared. He was one of the football players, tall and strong, the kind of guy who usually drew attention. Jody looked at him with a smile that seemed innocent at first glance, but something in her eyes betrayed another intention. You came, she said, stepping closer to the boy. Of course I did, he replied, unaware of the danger approaching. So, what did you want? Without answering, Jody took another step toward him, her eyes fixed on his. The air around her seemed to change, as if a sinister presence was growing. She tilted her head slightly, studying the boy for a moment before smiling more broadly. I'm hungry, Jody said calmly, the sweetness in her voice contrasting with the darkness growing in her eyes. The boy looked at her, confused. What did you say? Without warning, Jody lunged with surprising speed, grabbing him by the shoulders. Before he could react, she pulled him close and with unnatural strength, sank her teeth into his neck. The boy tried to fight, but it was useless. Jody's hunger was insatiable. As the blood flowed, Jody felt the boy's life force being drained, strengthening her with each passing second. She continued to devour him without mercy, savoring every moment. The player's body quickly weakened, his attempts to escape becoming futile until, finally, he collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Jody, now rejuvenated, wiped her lips and looked down at the body with cold indifference. That was delicious, she murmured, satisfied, before disappearing into the shadows, leaving the lifeless body behind the bleachers. Clark and Chloe arrived at the farm, the truck coming to a smooth stop beside the barn. Clark turned off the engine but remained seated for a moment, his gaze fixed on the barn ahead. Chloe, noticing the silence, frowned, curious. Clark, are you okay? Chloe asked, turning to him from the passenger seat. Clark sighed deeply, opening the door and stepping out. I need to show you something, Chloe, he said, his voice serious, as he walked toward the barn. Chloe, intrigued, got out of the truck and followed him. What's so important that you can't just tell me here? Clark opened the barn door, the sound of the hinges creaking softly. He looked inside for a moment, as if preparing for what was to come. Chloe, still curious, walked in behind him. Clark, you're starting to freak me out. What's going on? Chloe asked, her tone filled with concern. Clark turned to her, his face more serious than usual. There are a lot of things I've never told you, Chloe. And I think now it's time for you to know some of them. Chloe crossed her arms, clearly skeptical. All right, Clark. Spill it. What aren't you telling me? Clark looked at Chloe for a long moment before sighing, his hands moving nervously. He knew this conversation was inevitable, but it was still hard to begin. Chloe. I'm not like the others, Clark said, his voice low and serious, looking directly into her eyes. I have abilities beyond what anyone can imagine. Chloe frowned, not fully understanding. Abilities? What are you talking about, Clark? Clark took a deep breath, deciding it was time to show rather than just tell. He glanced at one of the hay bales stacked in the corner of the barn. "I have super strength," Clark said, walking over to the bale and easily lifting it above his head with one hand. The bale seemed as light as a feather in his hands. Chloe's mouth dropped open, her face full of surprise and amazement. "I'm also really fast," Clark continued, and before Chloe could respond, he moved at super speed, running from one side of the barn to the other in a matter of seconds, appearing as a blur before her eyes. Chloe covered her mouth, clearly impressed, her eyes wide as she tried to process what she was seeing. "And there's more," Clark said, returning to her side. "I can hear things from far away. My hearing is super sensitive. And I'm practically indestructible." Indestructible. Chloe murmured, still trying to absorb everything he had just shown her. "Yes, Chloe. Almost nothing can hurt me," Clark explained, his tone softer now, realizing how shocking all of this must be for her. "That's why when you see all the accidents around here and I come out without a scratch, it's because of that." Chloe remained silent for a moment, clearly processing all the information. She took a step back, placing her hands on her hips as she tried to form a question. "This is incredible, Clark. You're like a superhero or something," Chloe said, with an incredulous smile on her face, still trying to get used to the idea. Clark shook his head slightly. "I don't see myself as a hero, Chloe. I'm just trying to live my life as best I can. But this puts me in complicated situations." Chloe laughed nervously, still impressed. "Complicated? This is amazing, Clark. How did you manage to hide this for so long?" "I had to hide it, Chloe. And that's why I need to warn you about something," Clark said, his tone becoming serious again. "I'm not the only one around here. There are more people with abilities. And over time, more will show up." Chloe crossed her arms, looking at him curiously. "What do you mean by more people? Are there others like you?" "Yes," Clark replied, with a somber expression. "And many of these people can be dangerous. That's why I'm asking you. You need to be careful with your wall of weird and the articles you write about the strange things happening in Smallville." Chloe frowned, visibly concerned by what Clark was suggesting. "Are you telling me to stop investigating? To stop telling the stories of what's happening here?" "Not exactly," Clark said, trying to find the right words. "I'm just saying that it could put you in danger, Chloe. There are people, and things, out there that are very dangerous. And the more you dig, the bigger the risk." Chloe stayed quiet for a moment, thinking it over. She knew Clark was trying to protect her, but at the same time, she was a journalist at heart, always searching for the truth. "Clark, I understand what you're saying. And I appreciate that you care about me," Chloe said, her gaze determined. "But you know I can't just stop. I need to keep telling these stories, it's what I do." "Chloe, you don't understand. It's not just you who'll be in danger," Clark said, with a serious expression, stepping closer to her. "If you keep investigating and exposing these strange things happening in Smallville, it won't just be you who'll suffer the consequences. Your family, your friends, my parents, everyone will be at risk." Chloe frowned, realizing the weight of Clark's words. "You think the government would do something like that? You think they'd come after me?" Clark sighed, looking away for a moment. "It's not a matter of thinking, Chloe. I know they would. They already have a presence in Smallville. If you start exposing these things, you'll draw their attention, and you know what the government does with what it doesn't understand. You've heard stories, right? People being quarantined, or worse, being dissected like some kind of scientific experiment," Clark continued, his voice dark. "You could be next. Or anyone close to you." Chloe blinked, feeling a chill run down her spine. "Clark, that sounds extreme. Do you really think the government would do something like that?" "Yes," Clark answered without hesitation. "They would. If they find out someone like me exists, they won't stop until they capture me. And the worst part is, they won't just be satisfied with me. Anyone who knows the truth will be a target. You'd essentially be throwing your friends under the bus. The people you love. And I can't let that happen." Chloe swallowed hard, the gravity of the revelation finally sinking in. I didn't know it was that serious, Clark." "It's very serious, Chloe," Clark said, placing his hand on her shoulder. "I know you want to tell these stories, but the truth is, Sometimes exposing these things can be more dangerous than protecting the people involved. I don't want to put anyone in danger, Clark, Chloe said, her voice softer now. But, what do I do then? Just stay quiet and let these things happen. You can still tell stories, Chloe, but you need to pick your battles wisely, Clark said. Some things are safer left in the shadows. If exposing the truth means risking the lives of your friends, it's no different than betraying them. Chloe looked at Clark, her eyes full of uncertainty. I'll think about it, Clark, Chloe finally said, with a resigned tone. But you have to understand, it's not easy for me to just stop. Clark sighed internally. She still doesn't fully understand. She's the kind of person who only changes after facing the consequences. He thought, knowing that despite his words, Chloe wouldn't give up on her investigation so easily. Still, he had a plan. With a smooth gesture, Clark tucked a strand of Chloe's hair behind her ear, keeping his gaze fixed on hers. I appreciate your passion, Chloe, but I just want to make sure you don't get hurt in the process. As he made the gesture, Clark, almost imperceptibly, began to exert a mental influence over her. He knew he couldn't change who she was entirely, but he could at least plant a seed of caution. Subtly, he inserted thoughts of hesitation, of worry, that would make her think twice before diving headfirst into something dangerous. You don't have to stop investigating, Clark murmured softly, keeping his tone calm. But maybe it's better to be careful, to think twice before exposing certain things. Chloe nodded slowly, as if absorbing the words, but Clark knew it was more than that. His mental influence, though subtle, was helping to shape her decisions. She would still be the determined investigator she always was, but now with a restraint he had put in place. I'll try, Clark, Chloe said, her voice softer but still determined. I don't want to put you, or anyone, at risk. Clark feigned a relieved smile, knowing the changes he had made to her mind were working. Thank you, Chloe. I knew you'd understand. Of course, she didn't change on her own, Clark thought. But I'll let her believe she did. Clark watched as Chloe seemed more at ease, as if she had finally accepted the need to be more cautious. He knew that, with these subtle changes, she would be safer, at least for now. I knew you'd make the right decision, Clark said, with a light smile. You're amazing, Chloe. You always have been. Chloe gave a faint smile, still thoughtful, but visibly calmer. Thanks, Clark. I guess I needed to hear that. Clark internally sighed with relief, satisfied that he had achieved what he wanted without having to push too hard. He knew that, in time, Chloe might face the consequences, but for now, he had managed to take a step to ensure her safety. Let's get out of here and get some fresh air, Clark said, placing an arm around her shoulders and guiding her out of the barn, where the daylight still shone gently. As they walked, Clark reflected on how much he would need to continue controlling certain situations. He knew he couldn't always protect everyone he loved, but at least in that moment, he had managed to prevent a possible catastrophe. For now, Clark thought, with a slight shadow of disappointment still lingering in his mind. The next day at school, the atmosphere was calm, and the students went about their usual routine. Chloe stood in front of her famous wall of weird, with a serious expression on her face. Clark watched from a distance as Chloe began to remove, one by one, the articles pinned to the wall. Each piece of paper she tore down seemed like she was leaving a part of herself behind. I still can't believe I'm doing this, Chloe muttered, as she took down one of the older stories. I spent years collecting these stories, and now I'm taking everything apart. Clark stepped closer, his expression neutral, but his eyes closely watching her movements. I know it's hard, Chloe, but it's the best thing to do for now, Clark said, trying to offer some comfort. You're doing this to protect everyone, including yourself. Chloe sighed, placing her hand on one of the most important headlines she had posted. The yellowed paper showed signs of time, representing years of dedication and work. I just never thought I'd have to stop, Chloe said, her voice softer now. This was my life for so long. All these stories, these investigations, it's what defined me. Clark moved even closer until he was standing beside her. You can still investigate, Chloe. But in a safer, more careful way, he said, looking directly at the wall. Not everything needs to be exposed, at least not right now. Chloe shook her head, still reluctant but knowing Clark was right. It's just temporary, Chloe said with a sigh as she pulled down another story. I'll come back to this someday. Clark nodded, watching as she continued. I'm sure you will, Chloe. But until then, we'll make sure everyone is safe. Chloe stayed quiet for a moment, staring at the nearly empty wall in front of her, before finally taking down the last article with a gentle pull. That's it, Chloe said, looking at the now bare wall. It's over. Clark placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a supportive smile. It's not over, Chloe. It's just changing. Chloe looked at him, a faint smile on her face, though there was still a sadness in her eyes. I know, Clark. Thanks for helping me see that, Chloe said, taking a step back and gazing at the empty wall. The distant sound of students in the hallways mixed with the silence between them, creating a sense of closure but also of a new beginning. Let's get out of here, Clark said, still keeping his hand on her shoulder. Chloe nodded, and together, they walked away from the wall, leaving behind an important chapter of her life. At the Luthor mansion, Lex was sitting in one of the armchairs in his office, while a doctor, with a perplexed expression, analyzed the results of his physical exams. The room was silent, except for the soft rustling of papers being flipped through by the doctor. What did you find, doctor? Lex asked. The doctor shook his head, looking confused. Your tests show an abnormally high white blood cell count, Lex. It's not common, but it doesn't point directly to leukemia or any other serious illness. Lex raised an eyebrow, leaning back in the chair. I never get sick, doctor. When I was a child, I had asthma, but after I lost my hair, well, the asthma disappeared. I haven't been ill since. The doctor removed his glasses and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. It's unusual, but it's not the first time I've seen something like this in Smallville. Some people believe that the Luthor Corp fertilizer plant is contaminating the environment. Lex remained silent for a moment, his sharp gaze fixed on the doctor. So you think the environment is causing these changes in me? The doctor shrugged, a slight discomfort visible. I can't say for sure, Lex. But it's something I've noticed in some patients here. Smallville seems to have its peculiarities. Lex smiled faintly, an enigmatic smile. Smallville, the town where the impossible happens. The doctor nodded, clearly uneasy with what he was revealing. I'll keep monitoring your tests, Lex. Any changes, and I'll let you know immediately. Lex thanked him with a slight nod, dismissing the doctor. As soon as he was alone, he walked over to the computer on his desk. Opening the browser out of curiosity, he decided to check the Smallville Torch website, the school newspaper Chloe managed. When the page loaded, a headline caught his attention. Smallville, one of America's strangest towns. Lex smiled to himself, reading Chloe's article, which detailed strange and mysterious events occurring in the town. It was intriguing, to say the least, how many anomalies seemed to be concentrated in one location. Chloe Sullivan, Lex murmured, as he continued to read the article. You're closer to the truth than you realize. Lex kept reading, absorbing the information from the Smallville Torch site. A sequence of headlines passed before his eyes, each one more intriguing than the last. It seemed that Smallville held far more secrets than he had initially imagined. Inexplicable incidents, strange mutations, bizarre accidents. Lex murmured as he read, his eyes scanning the pages with growing interest. Then another headline caught his attention, standing out from the rest. Former Metropolis University professor expelled for theories on kryptonite meteorites, now selling plastic meteorites to tourists. Dr. Stephen Hamilton. Lex read the name aloud, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. Lex shook his head as he continued to read about Dr. Hamilton, who had once been a respected authority in geology until his theories about the Smallville meteorites led to his expulsion from the university. Hamilton claims that the meteorites found in Smallville possess unusual properties and are affecting both people and the surrounding environment. Currently, he is regarded as a joke in academic circles and is selling meteorite replicas to tourists by the roadside. Lex smiled slightly. A discredited scientist who knows more than he's saying, sounds promising. He scrolled down the page until he found the address of the location where Dr. Hamilton was supposedly selling his plastic meteorites. Lex immediately copied the information, already decided on paying a visit. Maybe this Dr. Hamilton has answers others prefer to ignore, Lex murmured to himself, standing up from his chair and grabbing his jacket. It's time to ask some questions. Clark stood behind the bleachers, the cold wind blowing gently as he looked at the horrific scene in front of him. The body of one of the football players lay on the ground, completely drained, with pale, sagging skin and wasted muscles. The stench of decay was beginning to fill the air. Another corpse for the underground, Clark thought, frowning. He knelt slowly beside the body, showing no signs of disgust or hesitation. His eyes quickly moved over the corpse, scanning it. Clark placed his hands on the body, effortlessly making it intangible, his gaze calm and determined. In seconds, he sunk the corpse into the ground, letting it disappear entirely into the cold earth, leaving no trace. When the body was completely gone, Clark stood up, brushing his hands lightly, as if wiping away any remnants of the act. The wind blew again, the smell of decay quickly dissipating as the body was buried deep beneath the ground. I need to deal with Jody soon. Clark looked around, making sure no one had witnessed what he had just done, before leaving the area behind the bleachers and heading toward the school. Lex was driving at high speed along the deserted roads of Smallville, the sound of the engine echoing in the quiet landscape. When he finally spotted the property he was looking for, he slowed down and parked near a small roadside stand. Meteor Rock Souvenirs, the sign was worn, and the stand appeared abandoned, with only a few stones stacked for sale. Lex ignored the shabby structure and walked on, his eyes focused on a barn visible in the distance. He quickly made his way across the property, passing by the stand without hesitation, until he reached the barn. When he opened the large wooden door, what he found wasn't a common storage space, but an improvised research laboratory. Dr. Stephen Hamilton stood in the center of the barn, hunched over a metal table, examining a small glowing rock through a microscope. He seemed absorbed in his work, unaware of Lex's presence until the door closed with a faint thud. "Hamilton," Lex said calmly, taking a few steps toward the scientist. Dr. Hamilton jumped, lifting his head quickly and locking eyes with Lex. Who are you? What do you want here?" "I'm Lex Luthor. I'm here because I believe you have information that might interest me." Dr. Hamilton frowned, clearly distrustful. "Luthor? I'm not interested in your family's business. I've made it clear that my work is serious." "I take your work seriously too," Lex responded, with a persuasive tone. "I read your theories about the meteorites in Smallville. I found them fascinating, and I believe we can help each other." "No one takes my work seriously. I was expelled from the scientific community, ridiculed for suggesting that these meteorites have special properties." Lex took another step forward, looking directly at Hamilton. "I believe you. The question is, what could you accomplish with the right resources? Money, equipment, anything you need." Dr. Hamilton shook his head, still distrustful. "Why should I trust you? What exactly do you want with my studies?" "I want answers. Smallville is at the center of events no one can explain. You can help me understand what's happening here. In return, I'll give you the resources to continue your research. No restrictions," Lex said. Hamilton stayed silent for a few seconds, evaluating Lex's offer. He glanced at his old, worn-out equipment, clearly tempted by the offer, but something still made him hesitate. "I don't trust you, Luthor," Hamilton finally said, his voice filled with skepticism. "Your family is involved in too many things. I won't sell my soul to the devil." Lex took a deep breath, keeping calm. "I'm not asking you to sell anything. Just think about what I'm offering. Think about how much you could discover. How much you could prove that you were right all along." Hamilton still seemed reluctant, but Lex knew he had planted the seed of doubt. "You don't have to decide now," Lex said, stepping back. "Just think about the offer. I'll be waiting for your answer." With that, Lex turned around, leaving the barn and allowing Hamilton to be alone with his thoughts. He knew that sooner or later, the scientist would give in. Clark entered Jody's greenhouse, feeling the stifling warmth of the space mixed with the strong scent of plants and vegetables growing in abundance. The leaves were slightly dry, and the faint sound of the wind gently swayed the structure. "The place is empty." Clark walked toward the rows of vegetables, noticing a few strange plants scattered among them. "There they are," Clark said, crouching down and pulling one of the green rocks from beneath a head of lettuce. His firm touch wasn't affected by the kryptonite, and he held it naturally, placing it directly into his backpack. Clark continued his meticulous search, collecting each piece of kryptonite he found hidden between the vegetables and garden beds. He searched every corner, knowing he couldn't leave any behind. After gathering all the kryptonite, Clark stood up, looking around the greenhouse. The plants that had once been vibrant now seemed like a direct threat. He knew the kryptonite's influence was responsible for the anomalies and, more importantly, for Jody's problems. Time to end this. Clark's eyes glowed with intensity as he aimed his heat vision at the plants. A red beam shot through the air, burning the leaves and stems with precision. In seconds, the intense heat turned the vegetables and herbs into ashes. FSSSHHH. The sound of the flames consuming the plants echoed through the greenhouse as smoke quickly rose to the ceiling. Clark continued using his heat vision, moving it back and forth, ensuring that every plant was completely destroyed. When the last flames died out, the greenhouse was filled with ashes. The once green, lively space was now a pile of charred remnants. That should solve the problem, Clark said, as he zipped up his backpack, now full of kryptonite. Clark gave the greenhouse one final look before leaving, satisfied with the result. He knew that with the kryptonite stored away and the plants destroyed, Jody would no longer have access to anything dangerous. Clark left the greenhouse and in an instant, used his super speed to return to the farm. When he arrived at the barn, he stopped abruptly, the quiet surroundings amplifying his focus. Time to store this. Clark entered the barn. He became intangible. His body passed through the wooden floor as if there were no resistance. Descending underground, Clark headed toward the spot where he had already hidden the backpack full of money. With a fluid motion, he placed the kryptonite-filled backpack next to the other. Perfect. Clark took $1,000 from the money backpack and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He glanced around one more time, ensuring everything was in order before emerging back to the surface. Back in the barn, Clark closed the door quietly, looking around to make sure no one had seen him. Time skip after school, Jody returned home, eager to check on the progress of her plants. The sun was beginning to set, and a gentle breeze blew as she approached the greenhouse. However, as soon as she opened the door, the smell of burning and the stifling heat hit her like a wave. What? Jody rushed inside, her eyes widening as she took in the scene of destruction before her. The plants, once vibrant and full of life, had been reduced to ashes. The leaves, stems, and everything she had planted were completely destroyed. No, no, no. Jody screamed, dropping to her knees, her trembling hand scooping up a handful of ash. Her fingers sifted through the lifeless ashes, and she let out a cry of frustration. My plants. Why, who would do this? She stood up suddenly, looking around the greenhouse as if expecting to find someone hiding. Her face was flushed with anger, and tears began to form in her eyes. This was everything to me, all I had. Jody ran her hands through her hair, pulling it tightly as she paced back and forth, her eyes wild. The surge of rage and despair built up inside her, the feeling of loss becoming unbearable. She started punching the glass floor of the greenhouse, feeling the anger burn through her veins. I'm going to find out who did this. Jody shouted, her voice filled with determination and fury. They'll pay for this. Her breathing was heavy, her fists still clenched, and her eyes were now a mixture of pain and vengeance. Jody ran out of the greenhouse toward the house. Her legs barely kept up with her, and her breathing was erratic, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. As soon as she entered the kitchen, her eyes locked onto the fridge. Without a second thought, she yanked it open with a violent pull. I need something. I need more. Jody muttered, her trembling hands grabbing whatever she could. She began to eat uncontrollably, grabbing everything in sight, vegetables, raw foods, without any restraint. It was as if her body demanded more energy, more nutrition, but nothing seemed to satisfy her. Clark, intangible, was watching everything closely. Clark approached Jody silently, still invisible to her. When he was close enough, he extended his hand, placing it gently on Jody's head. You're going to forget this. Jody's eyes widened for a moment, as if trying to fight against some invisible force, but soon her shoulders relaxed. Her mind was being shaped by Clark's words, and slowly, the insatiable craving for plants and the kryptonite's influence faded away. You will never touch those plants again. Never, Clark repeated, his words sinking deep into Jody's mind like an anchor. Jody, still in a trance, let the food fall from her hands, and gradually, her eyes began to close. Her body gave in, and she gently collapsed to the kitchen floor, unconscious. Clark sighed, looking at her for a moment before activating his X-ray vision. He scanned Jody's body quickly, and to his surprise, her stomach was tinted with a greenish hue. She just needs to poop or worst-case scenario, a stomach pump. Clark focused for a moment, and in a matter of seconds, his form began to change. His features shifted, his height shrank, and soon he had taken on the exact appearance of Jody Melville. His disguise was flawless. Time to make this work. He grabbed Jody's phone and quickly searched for Pete's number. As soon as he found it, he dialed, waiting anxiously as the phone rang. "Hello." Pete answered, his voice carefree. "Jody? Hey. Everything okay?" Pete. "I'm not feeling very well," Clark, now using Jody's voice, said, sounding a bit weak and worried. "I think I ate something bad. I'm home alone, and I don't know what to do." "You're alone? That doesn't sound good. Where are you?" Pete asked, sounding concerned. "I'm at home in the kitchen," Clark replied, keeping the tone vulnerable. "Can you come over? Please." "Of course. I'm on my way." "Hang in there, Jody," Pete said, already rushing. "Thank you, Pete," Clark said before hanging up the phone. Clark put Jody's phone back in her pocket, looking at her unconscious body on the kitchen floor. He stepped back a bit, observing the result of his actions. For a moment, he felt a slight satisfaction. "I didn't have to kill her, and I even helped Pete's love life," Clark thought, a smile of accomplishment forming on his face. "If that's not being a hero, I don't know what is." As he waited for Pete's arrival, Clark reflected on his decisions. Instead of simply eliminating Jody as he had done with others who posed a threat, he found a solution that didn't involve death, something that, despite his growing coldness, was still a relief. He knew he was playing a dangerous game with his morality, but for now, this plan seemed ideal. Clark glanced around one last time, making sure everything was in order before leaving the house quickly. He transformed into a shadow, intangible and invisible, slipping out the door as he waited from afar for Pete's arrival. Pete arrived quickly at Jody's house, with Bill, his dad, alongside him. He parked the car in a hurry and got out, already feeling the growing concern. "Dad, let's hurry." She said she wasn't feeling well. Bill followed his son, with a serious expression. "Calm down, Pete. Let's see what's going on. It might not be that bad." The two rushed toward the door. Pete knocked, but when he realized it was unlocked, he opened it and stepped inside, calling out for her. "Jody? Jody, are you here?" Pete looked around quickly, until he saw Jody lying on the kitchen floor, unconscious. "Dad here." Bill rushed in behind Pete, his eyes widening at the sight of the young girl collapsed on the floor. "Let's get her into the car." "Looks like she fainted," Bill said, already bending down to help his son lift Jody. Pete grabbed Jody by the shoulders, while Bill held her legs. Carefully, the two lifted her and quickly carried her out to the car. "She doesn't seem injured," Bill commented as they placed Jody in the back seat of the car. "But we shouldn't take any chances. We're taking her to the hospital." Pete nodded, still nervous, and climbed into the car beside the girl. Bill rounded the vehicle and got into the driver's seat. "Drive fast, Dad," Pete said, looking worriedly at Jody. "She can't stay like this." Bill started the car and sped off toward the hospital. As the car sped down the road, Pete watched over Jody, hoping she would wake up soon. "It'll be okay, Jody. I promise," Pete murmured, more to himself than to her. Meanwhile, Clark watched from afar. The road stretched ahead, illuminated only by the headlights of Clark's truck as he and Chloe made their way to Lex's house. The comfortable silence between them was soon broken by Chloe, who sighed, looking out the window, clearly deep in thought. Pete was so excited to go to the party with Jody. "It's such bad luck," she said, turning to Clark, a hint of frustration visible on her face. Clark kept his eyes on the road, feigning surprise as he responded. "Really?" He was excited to go. "What happened?" "Jody got sick, Clark. He's with her at the hospital right now. Apparently, she fainted. They don't really know what happened." Chloe explained, crossing her arms as she looked back out the window. "Pete was so pumped for their date, you know." "That's bad luck," Clark said, shaking his head slightly. "But the party can happen any time. The important thing is that Jody is okay and will be out soon." Chloe nodded, but still seemed thoughtful. "You're right. But it's frustrating to see Pete so excited and then have something like this happen on their first date." Clark gave a soft smile, trying to comfort her. "I'm sure they'll have other chances." Pete's a good guy, and Jody will probably feel better soon. I hope so. He deserves something good. Chloe responded, relaxing a bit more in her seat, clearly more at ease with the idea that things would work out. The gentle hum of the truck's engine and the quiet of the road filled the rest of the drive, while both continued on toward Lex's house, the subject of Pete and Jody still lingering in their minds, but with the certainty that everything would turn out fine. Chloe and Clark finally arrived at the party at Lex's mansion. The lights of the house shone brightly, and the distant sound of music filled the air as they approached the entrance. Lana was standing at the door, smiling as she saw the two of them. "I'm so glad you guys made it," Lana said, waving to them enthusiastically. "The party is already in full swing, come in." Clark smiled back while Chloe gave a small wave. "Of course, Lana. It looks like it's going great." They entered the mansion, where soft lights and the sound of laughter filled the space. As Chloe and Lana began chatting about the party details, Clark spotted Lex in the distance, in a quieter corner of the house, away from the music and noise. Clark motioned to Lex, who returned the gesture with a smile, and the two made their way to a more isolated area where they could talk without being interrupted. "Your book is selling well, Clark. Tomorrow, come by my house again, and we can discuss the profits," Lex said, his expression satisfied with the results. "I will, Lex, but I believe the sales are more due to the Luther name than my work. The Luther name might get someone to buy the book once, but for them to buy it a second time, it has to be good. Your book is getting good reviews, and there are a lot of people eager to meet Clark Kent," Lex said. Clark gave a small smirk, realizing that despite his insecurities, the book was indeed being well received. "Let's give them what they're curious about then." "Of course. An interview for the paper, a book signing, and you'll be famous, Clark. And of course it'll be great publicity for me, the man who discovered Clark Kent's talent, straight from the heart of Smallville," Lex said with a shrewd smile. Clark chuckled lightly, knowing Lex was always thinking of a bigger benefit. "Looks like we're all winning with this, Lex. As long as things stay under control." "Don't worry, Clark. I'll make sure everything runs smoothly. That's the advantage of working with a Luther," Lex said. The two exchanged smiles and shook hands briefly before Clark returned to where Chloe was. "You and Lex seem to be plotting something," Chloe joked, watching Clark approach. "Should I be worried?" Clark smiled, shaking his head. "Nothing to worry about. Just business." "Let's dance, Clark," Chloe said, pulling him by the arm before he could protest. Clark laughed, following Chloe to the dance floor, where the music was already lively. The sound of the music filled the air, and soon they were dancing with the other guests, laughing and having fun. Though Clark was a bit more reserved, he relaxed upon seeing Chloe so comfortable. Thump, thump, thump. The beat of the music echoed through the floor as Chloe and Clark moved lightly and playfully, laughing at the scenes around them and enjoying the moment. "You're doing a lot better than I thought, Chloe," Clark teased with a mischievous smile. "I'm trying to keep up with you," Chloe replied, smiling back, feeling more at ease. After a few songs, they left the dance floor, both out of breath and smiling, heading toward a quieter part of the house. Chloe grabbed 2 cups of juice and handed one to Clark, sitting down next to him on one of the sofas. "That was fun," Chloe commented, a satisfied smile on her face as she took a sip of her juice. Clark nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, it was. It's been a while since I danced like that." Chloe looked at Clark for a moment, a thoughtful expression on her face before smiling again. "You should talk to Lana," Chloe suggested casually, but her eyes watched Clark's reaction closely. Clark frowned, surprised by the suggestion. "Talk to Lana? Why?" Chloe rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed by his surprise. "What? I'm not some possessive, jealous woman. And after the secret you told me, it would be wrong if I didn't trust you." Clark smiled softly, realizing Chloe was right. "I know, Chloe. I just wasn't expecting the suggestion." "Look, Whitney couldn't make it tonight, and she's feeling lonely," Chloe explained in a more understanding tone. "You guys are friends, despite everything, or am I wrong?" Clark remained silent for a moment, indifferent to Chloe's question, as if lost in his own thoughts. He took a sip of his juice, not responding immediately. Chloe, noticing Clark's hesitation, gave a slight smile and didn't push any further, turning her attention back to the party around them. Clark finally stood up, leaving the empty cup on the table beside him, and glanced around the room. He spotted Lana and calmly walked through the crowd, passing by a few guests before finally reaching the balcony where Lana stood. She was leaning on the railing, gazing at the night sky, her thoughts clearly distant. "Lana," Clark called softly as he approached. She turned when she heard her name, a gentle smile forming on her lips. "Clark." "What a surprise," Lana said with a hint of surprise, but clearly happy to see him. "What brings you here?" Clark gave a small smile and stood beside her at the railing. "I just saw you alone and thought I'd check on you." "Yeah. Whitney couldn't come tonight, and I guess I just didn't know what to do," Lana admitted, letting out a sigh. "The party is great, but sometimes it's strange being surrounded by people and still feeling alone." She looked up at the sky, her thoughts seeming distant as she continued. "My friends from the cheerleading squad. They stopped talking to me when I left the team and started working." Clark, listening to Lana's words, took a step forward and struck a heroic pose, placing one foot on the balcony railing as he gazed at the moonlit sky. "It's normal that they don't understand you, Lana. After all, you took one small step for a woman, but one giant leap for a 15-year-old student." Lana, surprised by Clark's pose and words, couldn't hold back her laughter. "Thanks for the words, Clark Armstrong," she said, still laughing lightly. Clark scratched the back of his head, visibly embarrassed. "It sounded better in my head." The light and relaxed atmosphere between them made Lana feel more comfortable. She looked at Clark, smiling warmly. "I always knew you had a funny side, Clark. You always managed to make me smile, even in the strangest situations." Clark smiled back, feeling satisfied that he had managed to cheer Lana up a little. "That's what friends are for, right?" "Right," Lana responded, smiling back at him. "Want to enjoy the rest of the party?" Clark asked with a light smile. "Do you want me to join you and Chloe?" Lana asked, surprised but clearly excited by the suggestion. "Sure. Me, you, and Chloe can enjoy the party together," Clark responded, keeping the tone casual. "Besides, I'm sure she'll love the company." Lana smiled, stepping away from the railing. "I think that's a great idea. Thanks for inviting me, Clark." Clark gestured for her to follow, and the two returned inside the mansion. As soon as they entered the main hall, they spotted Chloe near the dance floor, laughing with some of the other guests. "Chloe, look who I brought," Clark called out, catching her attention. Chloe turned and, upon seeing Lana, smiled excitedly. "Lana, I'm so glad you joined us." Lana smiled back, feeling more comfortable. "Clark convinced me. I thought it'd be nice to spend the rest of the party with you guys." "Great idea. Let's have fun," Chloe said, grabbing Lana's hand and pulling her toward the dance floor again. Clark followed, watching the two of them loosen up on the dance floor, laughing and dancing to the loud music. For the first time that night, Lana seemed to be relaxing and enjoying the moment, and Clark felt satisfied knowing he had helped make that happen. Lex entered Dr. Hamilton's lab for the second time, his quiet steps echoing on the concrete floor. The dim light illuminated the worn-out equipment, and a chemical scent lingered in the air. The scientist, hunched over his workstation, pretended not to notice Lex's presence. "Dr. Hamilton," Lex began with a calm smile, his voice carrying a subtle authority. "I came back to see if you've reconsidered my offer." The scientist slowly lifted his head, a mix of fatigue and apprehension in his eyes. "I already told you, Lex. I don't want any involvement with your family." "I don't need your money," Hamilton muttered, trying to keep his voice firm, but there was evident hesitation. "This isn't about money," Lex said, walking around the lab, examining the equipment. "It's about continuing your work. You have talent, Doctor, and I'm offering you the means to advance your research. Think carefully before letting this opportunity slip by." Hamilton glanced at his outdated instruments. Lex's offer was tempting, but the price of partnering with the Luthers concerned him. His indecision was clear. "You're forcing me into a decision," Hamilton said in a lower tone, trying to regain control. "How can I trust you?" Lex stopped, turning toward the scientist, his voice steady. "Trust takes time, Doctor. But with the right resources, you could go further than you ever imagined. Your research on Smallville's meteorites doesn't need to stagnate." Hamilton's eyes betrayed his resistance, locking onto the green stones on his table for a moment. Doubt consumed him. He knew he was standing at a crossroads. What do you really want, Lex? Hamilton asked, exhausted by the growing tension. Answers, Lex replied, directly. You do the research. I provide everything you need. In exchange, you share the results. It's as simple as that. Hamilton remained silent, his thoughts swirling. He knew Lex Luthor's power and influence, and he also knew that refusing could have consequences. His troubled past made him vulnerable, and Lex was certainly aware of that. And if I refuse? Hamilton stammered, hesitant. Lex flashed a subtle smile, unhurried. Doctor, no one needs threats. But second chances don't come every day. What do you say? The weight of the decision was evident on Hamilton's face. He knew that without Lex's resources, his research would be left to chance. There was no real choice. Fine, Hamilton sighed at last, his voice defeated. I accept. Lex extended his hand. You've made the right decision, Doctor. Let's see where this takes us. Hamilton hesitated for a brief moment before shaking Lex's hand, feeling as though the fate of his career, and perhaps his life, was now tied to the young Luthor. Satisfied, Lex left the lab, knowing he had achieved what he wanted. As he walked through the door, he murmured to himself, a new beginning, Doctor. Just that. The next day, Clark arrived at the Luthor mansion for a meeting that had been postponed for some time. Lex greeted him in the office, the space lit softly by the sunlight streaming through the large windows. Clark, I'm glad you could make it, Lex said, rising from his chair to greet him. Have a seat. We need to talk about the sales results of your book. Clark settled into the chair in front of Lex's desk, still not quite used to the formality that came with his sudden fame. Of course, Lex. I've been curious to know how things are going, Clark said, trying to hide the slight anxiety in his voice. Well, I'll get straight to the point, Lex began, opening a folder with the sales reports. Your book is selling very well, Clark. The reviews have been positive, and the demand keeps growing. I think it's time we started talking about profits and publicity. Clark leaned forward slightly, interested. I knew the sales were going well, but I didn't realize the scale it was reaching. Lex smiled shrewdly, as if knowing Clark had been underestimating the success of his own work. You're going to be a wealthy man, Clark. And I don't say that lightly. To be honest, it's not every day an author gets a 50% share of the sales with a publisher like Luthor. Clark frowned in surprise. I thought about that, Lex. I didn't think many authors could get 50% of the sales from their books. You're right, Lex responded more seriously. Normally, publishers keep 90% or more, and the authors barely make 10%. But in your case, it's different. You're not just a client, Clark. I consider you a friend. And that kind of partnership isn't something I'd offer to just anyone. Clark stayed silent for a moment, processing what Lex had said. He knew Lex always had a plan, a strategy. But he also felt that, on some level, Lex was being genuine. I appreciate that, Lex. I really do. I just hope this is good for you and your publishing house too, Clark said with a smile. Lex chuckled softly. Don't worry about me, Clark. The Luthor name sells on its own. But having a successful author like you associated with my company is something I see as a long-term investment. The more you grow, the more I grow too. Clark nodded, understanding the logic behind Lex's words. I get it. And what else is on the horizon? You mentioned publicity and interviews. Yes, we're planning a book signing soon, as well as an interview for the Inquisitor and other local publications. That should increase the visibility of your book even more. That sounds great, Clark responded, feeling more relaxed with the idea. And what about the second book? Lex leaned forward slightly in his chair, watching Clark with interest. The expectations for the second book are already high. Critics and the public love what you did with the first one, so it's natural they want more. Do you have any ideas in mind? Clark was silent for a moment, reflecting. I have some ideas, but nothing concrete yet. I need some time to organize everything. Lex nodded, understanding. Take all the time you need. The last thing we want is to rush the creation of something with as much potential as the first. Clark smiled, feeling more confident. I won't disappoint, Lex. I know you won't, Lex replied with a confident smile. We're just at the beginning of something big, Clark. And I'll be here to make sure everything runs as smoothly as possible. The two shook hands firmly, sealing not only the business agreement but also a partnership that, in Lex's eyes, could extend for a long time. For Clark, it was an opportunity to follow a new path, but he knew he'd have to tread carefully in the world that Lex controlled. Let's celebrate your success, Clark. You're about to see your life change in ways you can't even imagine, Lex said, standing up from his chair and signaling for Clark to follow him. As they walked through the mansion, Clark sensed that the conversation wasn't just about business. There was something deeper, a connection Lex was trying to strengthen. What Clark didn't know was how far Lex was willing to go to maintain that partnership. Metropolis Night Belinda Jenkins, exhausted after a long day, carefully placed her baby in the crib. The room was quiet, and the soft light from the lamp made the space feel cozy. As the child stared innocently at the ceiling, a barely perceptible noise echoed through the room. "Earl, is that you?" Belinda murmured, noticing a shadow moving by the door. Earl Jenkins stepped into the room, his shoulders slumped, an expression of weariness and nervousness on his face. He looked at his child, trying to smile as he slowly approached the crib. The baby gazed at him with curious eyes. I just wanted to say goodnight," Earl said hesitantly, reaching out with a trembling hand to pick up the baby. As his hands neared his son, a violent tremor ran through his body, and his hand jerked back suddenly. His heart raced, and he stepped back, frightened. "No, what's happening to me?" Earl whispered, staring at his hands, which now shook uncontrollably. The room around him began to shake along with him, the curtains swaying and the furniture vibrating as if an earthquake was happening. Belinda heard the noise and rushed into the room, alarmed. "Earl? Are you okay?" she asked, looking around, confused. However, when she looked at the crib, everything seemed normal. The baby was there, quiet, and Earl was nowhere to be seen. She frowned, her heart still racing with worry, and looked around the room. "Earl?" Belinda called, but only silence answered her. LuthorCorp under a torrential downpour, Earl stood outside the imposing LuthorCorp building, trembling uncontrollably. He held a small bottle of pills in his shaking hand, desperately trying to open the cap. But his fingers wouldn't obey, and the bottle fell from his hands. "No, not now," Earl murmured, panic rising in his voice as the pills spilled into the puddle, ruined by the rain. He looked up at the entrance to the building and with a final burst of willpower, ran toward it, pounding on the glass door. Will, please let me in. I need to talk to Lionel," Earl shouted, his voice filled with desperation. Will, the maintenance man, appeared on the other side of the door, a concerned expression on his face. "Earl? What's going on?" Will asked, hesitating for a moment as he saw the state Earl was in. "Please, Will, something happened to me at the factory in Smallville. I need to talk to Lionel. He has to know," Earl begged, the panic in his voice growing as his body began to tremble again. "You need a doctor, Earl. This is serious," Will said, approaching but hesitating to open the door. However, Earl lost control. His body shook violently, and suddenly, with a single abrupt motion, he shattered the glass door with the force of his hands. He collapsed to the ground, exhausted and terrified of what had just happened. "Earl, what did you do?" Will exclaimed, running to help the man up. As Will tried to lift him, Earl's body began to tremble again. He grabbed Will by the arms, trying to stabilize himself, but the tremors were uncontrollable. In a second, everything changed. Earl's violent shaking caused his arms to tighten with supernatural strength, and before he realized what was happening, Will's neck snapped with a horrifying crack. No, Will!" Earl screamed, horrified by what he had just done. He let go of Will's lifeless body, his hands trembling as he looked at his fingers, as if they were responsible for the tragedy. Not knowing what to do, Earl fled, disappearing into the darkness of the night, his heart filled with guilt and despair. The following night, Clark and Chloe were relaxing in the Kent farm living room. They were watching a movie on TV, laughing at a funny scene while eating popcorn. "This movie is actually better than I expected," Chloe said, grabbing another handful of popcorn and throwing herself onto the couch next to Clark. Clark smiled, but suddenly stopped chewing, frowning as he focused on something. "What is it, Clark?" Chloe asked, noticing his change in behavior. "I heard a noise in the barn," Clark said, shifting his gaze from the TV and focusing on the wall as if he were trying to see through it. "A noise?" Chloe asked, curious, sitting up straighter. Are you sure? It could just be the wind or something. Clark didn't answer immediately. He turned toward the wall, and his eyes glowed slightly as he activated his X-ray vision. Through the layers of wood and concrete, he saw the figure of a man moving stealthily in the barn. Someone's in the barn, Clark said, already getting up from the couch, his expression becoming more serious. What? Someone broke in. Chloe also stood up, alarmed. Let's go check it out. Clark was already heading for the door, moving with speed and determination. Chloe followed closely behind, clearly worried but curious about what was happening. Clark, wait for me, Chloe said, hurrying to catch up with him. Clark stepped out the door with Chloe right behind, their hurried steps crossing the path leading to the barn. The wind blew gently, but the tense atmosphere left no room for distractions. Do you think it's someone dangerous? Chloe asked, trying to keep up as Clark quickened his pace. I'm not sure yet, but we need to check, Clark said, without taking his eyes off the barn ahead. When they reached the entrance of the barn, Clark gestured for Chloe to stop. Stay behind me. We don't know who's inside. Chloe nodded, staying a bit further back as Clark slowly pushed open the door, the creaking of the wood echoing through the space. They stepped inside, and the sound of something moving stealthily reached them almost immediately. Did you hear that? Chloe whispered, her eyes widening as the sound of footsteps echoed through the darkness. Clark nodded, focused, moving carefully. He used his X-ray vision again and saw a figure trembling at the back, among the piles of hay. Stay here, Clark said, moving quickly toward the figure. As Clark got closer, he saw a man crouched on the ground, shaking uncontrollably. When he took another step forward, he finally recognized the face. Earl Jenkins, Clark muttered, his eyes narrowing. Earl Jenkins. From what I remember, his body vibrates trying to expel the kryptonite. If I use my powers, I might be able to help him. Clark knelt beside Earl, keeping a calm expression. Earl, it's me, Clark. What's going on? How did you get here? Earl trembled even more, his hands gripping the ground as he tried to speak. Clark. I can't control this. Everything's spiraling. What did I do? I hurt someone. Clark looked at Earl with concern, realizing how shaken he was. Calm down, Earl. We can fix this. You're safe here. Chloe slowly approached, curious and worried. Clark, what's happening to him? I'm not sure yet, but he needs help. Can you go back to the house and get a glass of water for him, please? Clark asked, trying to keep the situation under control. Chloe nodded quickly, glancing at Earl with concern before rushing toward the house. As soon as she left, Clark focused back on Earl, who was still trembling on the ground. Clark activated his X-ray vision, carefully examining Earl's body. He saw small fragments of kryptonite embedded in Earl's skin, causing the tremors. You're a lucky man, Earl, Clark murmured as he knelt beside the man. Gently, Clark placed his hand on a part of Earl's body that wasn't affected by the kryptonite. He used his power to make Earl intangible, allowing the kryptonite fragments to fall to the ground. As the pieces fell away, Earl's tremors began to subside. Healed, Clark said with a slight smile, satisfied with the result. Clark then placed his hand gently on Earl's head, concentrating for a moment before erasing his recent memories. You'll forget everything I did to help you, Clark said, his voice low but firm. You came here to ask my dad for money, and I convinced you to turn yourself in to the police. Earl relaxed on the ground, his body finally free of the tremors, his mind cleared of the traumatic memories. At that moment, Chloe returned with a glass of water in hand. She looked at Clark and then at Earl, relieved to see he seemed better. Is he okay? Chloe asked, handing the glass to Clark. Yes, he's better now, Clark said, taking the glass and offering it to Earl. He just needed some rest. Earl drank the water slowly, still visibly shaken but calmer. Chloe, still worried, watched the scene in silence, unaware of the details of what had really happened. Earl, stay in the barn tonight. Tomorrow, my dad will return from Metropolis, and he'll go with you to the police, Clark said. Earl, still breathless, slowly nodded. Thank you, Clark. I don't know what I would have done without you. Clark stood up, offering a brief nod. Everything will be fine. He turned to Chloe. Let's grab some things so he can rest comfortably here. Chloe followed Clark as the two left the barn, unease written on her face. Once they were far enough away, she looked at him, her voice hesitant. Why does Earl need to turn himself in to the police, Clark? What really happened to him? Clark paused for a moment, meeting Chloe's eyes before answering. He took someone's life, Chloe. It was an accident, but that doesn't change what happened. Clark's words echoed in Chloe's mind as she squeezed his hand in a silent gesture of support. My God, what a terrible situation. Clark sighed, trying to calm her. He's going to do the right thing. He'll turn himself in, and justice will decide his fate. Chloe held Clark's hand firmly as they walked back to the house. A palpable tension hung in the air as both tried to process the recent events. I hope he can overcome this, Chloe murmured, her voice low, filled with concern. He will, Clark affirmed, opening the house door. Let's get some blankets and something for him to eat. Clark returned to the barn with his arms full of blankets and a small bag of food. Earl, I brought some things to make you more comfortable tonight, Clark said, entering the barn slowly. Earl, still sitting on the ground, looked exhausted but calmer. His tremors had completely stopped, and he looked at Clark with gratitude in his eyes. Thank you, Clark. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here, Earl said, his voice still weak. Clark placed the blankets and the bag of food next to Earl. Everything's going to be fine. You can rest now. Tomorrow, my dad will be back, and he'll help you with the police. Earl nodded, visibly more at ease. He began to arrange the blankets around him, trying to get more comfortable. I just want this to end, Earl murmured as he lay on the ground, his eyes tired. It will end, Clark said firmly, watching the man settle down. Rest. I'll be around. Clark gave the barn one last look, making sure everything was in order. As he left, he turned off the light softly, leaving only the moonlight to illuminate the inside. He closed the barn door behind him, leaving Earl to a deserved and solitary rest, while the Kent farm remained quiet under the night sky. Clark woke up early that morning, the sun not yet breaking the horizon when he got up. In the kitchen, he started preparing breakfast. The smell of fresh food began to spread throughout the house when suddenly, Clark heard the unmistakable sound of a truck approaching along the dirt road leading to the farm. They got here early. Clark quickly turned off the stove and headed for the door, walking with firm steps toward the entrance of the house. As he stepped outside, he saw his father and mother's truck approaching, raising a small cloud of dust along the way. Clark walked quickly toward the truck, watching Jonathan step out of the vehicle with a curious look. Dad, I need to talk to you. Jonathan frowned, sensing the urgency in his son's voice. Of course, son. What happened? While Martha headed toward the house, Clark accompanied Jonathan to the barn, beginning to explain everything that had happened with Earl Jenkins the night before. They walked side by side down the dirt path, as Clark explained the situation in detail. Jonathan sighed, placing a hand on Clark's shoulder. Thanks for telling me, son. I'll take care of this now. Go tell your mother I'm handling the situation. Clark nodded, veering toward the house while Jonathan headed for the barn. As soon as Clark entered the house, he was met with a curious look from Martha, who was in the kitchen. Clark Kent, why did Chloe sleep here last night? Martha asked, raising an eyebrow. Clark stopped in the middle of the kitchen, trying to contain a smile. Would you believe me if I said I was scared to sleep alone? In an office building in Metropolis, Bob Rickman sat across from Paul Hendricks, one of the officials at the Center for Environmental Protection. The tension in the air was palpable as Paul, with a serious expression, tried to explain the situation. Rickman, you can't build another plant in Smallville, Paul said, his voice firm. Your last plant already contaminated the groundwater, and we have several lawsuits against you. This has to stop. Bob Rickman leaned forward with a carefree smile, as if Paul's words meant nothing to him. I understand your concern, Paul. But let's be realistic. Those lawsuits will disappear. You know how things work. Paul shook his head, clearly irritated. Not this time, Rickman. We have a restraining order against you. Until all these lawsuits are resolved, you're banned from building anything in Smallville. Rickman stood up calmly, adjusting his suit and walking toward the door. I believe you'll change your mind, Paul. In fact, I think you're already changing it. He extended his hand to Paul, offering a handshake. Paul, hesitant, accepted the gesture, not noticing the green glow that surrounded their hands during the handshake. His eyes glazed over, and his body tensed for a moment. "Paul, I know you're in pain," Rickman murmured, his voice soft and persuasive. "The only way to end this pain is to end your own life." Paul, still in a trance, nodded slowly, agreeing, while Rickman walked away with a satisfied smile. In the lobby, Rickman straightened his tie as he left the building, leaving behind an inevitable tragedy. Minutes later, a deafening sound echoed through the corridors. Crash. Paul Hendricks had jumped from the building's window, plummeting to his death. Rickman, now outside, heard the commotion but didn't look back. He simply smiled as he calmly walked down the sidewalk, knowing another obstacle had been removed from his path. Clark drove the truck along the road, the morning sun illuminating the way as he and Chloe talked. The comfortable silence was interrupted when Chloe, still curious, glanced at him. "You should have told me your parents had arrived," Chloe said, with a slight teasing tone, but clearly expecting an answer. "Sorry, Chloe. I was so focused on handling what was happening with Earl that I ended up forgetting," Clark replied with a sigh. Chloe frowned, intrigued. "And what happened with Earl, after all?" "My dad took him to the police this morning and hired a lawyer to help with the case," Clark explained, keeping his eyes on the road. "That's good. I hope he has a chance to redeem himself," Chloe said, now more at ease. As the truck approached Chloe's house, the sun shone over the surrounding trees. Clark parked the car in front of her driveway and turned off the engine. Chloe looked at him, smiling. "Thanks for bringing me, Clark. And for everything today." Clark returned the smile. "You know you can count on me." Chloe leaned in and gave Clark a quick kiss before stepping out of the truck. She waved one last time as she walked toward her front door, disappearing after entering. Clark watched for a few seconds, taking a deep breath, before starting the engine again and driving back to the farm, the sunlight accompanying his journey home. "Lana, I'm sorry I missed your party," Whitney said with a tone of regret as they rode through the field. The sun shone brightly in the sky, and the weather was pleasant, but Whitney still felt guilty. "It's okay, Whitney," Lana replied, smiling at him. "You had important things to deal with. The party wasn't that amazing anyway." They continued riding side by side for a while, enjoying each other's company, until Lana, feeling a competitive spirit, smiled mischievously. "How about a race?" Lana asked, already pulling the reins of her horse to gain speed without waiting for Whitney's response. Whitney, surprised, smiled and started to accelerate, but Lana had already gained a considerable lead. The wind hit Lana's face, and she laughed as she looked back to see Whitney trying to catch up. However, when she looked back, Lana didn't notice the man standing ahead, in the middle of the trail. The horse neighed loudly as she pulled the reins sharply to avoid a collision, but lost her balance and fell from the horse. Thud. "Lana!" Whitney shouted, rushing to catch up with her. The man in the path quickly kneeled beside Lana, trying to help her up. She was dazed, but seemed okay. "Get your hands off her!" Whitney yelled furiously as he jumped off his horse and ran toward them. The man, scared by Whitney's approach, quickly backed off, running into the forest without saying a word. Whitney knelt beside Lana, helping her sit up. "Are you okay? Did that guy hurt you?" he asked, concerned, glancing in the direction the man had fled. "I'm fine, Whitney. I didn't even see him. I just fell off the horse when I tried to swerve," Lana replied, rubbing her shoulder, which ached from the fall. Whitney looked at Lana, still worried but not entirely convinced. "Are you sure? He didn't do anything to you?" Lana shook her head, trying to reassure him. "I'm sure, Whitney. It was just an accident." Whitney sighed, still suspicious. He helped Lana stand, and they both returned to their horses. "Let's head back home," Whitney said, giving one last look in the direction of the forest before mounting his horse. Lana agreed, and the two rode back to the farm, the incident still lingering in Whitney's mind. Clark was driving toward the farm, the clear blue sky without a single cloud, when in the distance, he saw Whitney helping Lana down from her horse. He frowned for a moment, but soon relaxed. She must have fallen, nothing to worry about. As he passed them, Clark, curious, activated his telepathy to try and read Lana's mind. He wanted to know what had really happened there. As he delved into her mind, he saw flashes of the mysterious man in the path and the sudden fall from the horse. This episode is about that guy who wants to buy the farm. Clark frowned, quickly connecting the dots. He knew that man had nefarious intentions and could be involved in something much bigger. All I need to do is cut off his hand, erase a few memories, and hypnotize him to confess his crimes about the environment. Clark continued his way to the farm, remaining calm on the outside but already devising a plan in his mind. At the reception party in Smallville, the atmosphere was sophisticated, with elegant guests. Bob was the center of attention, chatting with local businessmen and displaying his usual charm. Among the attendees, Lex watched the scene cautiously. He knew Rickman wasn't just an ordinary businessman. "Come to ruin Smallville soil too, Rickman?" Lex said, approaching with a disguised smile, but the tone in his voice was challenging. "Lex Luthor," Bob replied with a cold smile. "Everything I do is within the law. Just trying to bring progress to this town. You know how it is, right?" Lex narrowed his eyes, clearly skeptical. "Laws that you seem to bend to your convenience. Where exactly do you plan to build, Rickman?" "I've chosen the Kent farm as the site for my new pesticide factory. A perfect location, central and productive." Lex shook his head and laughed, his expression showing disbelief. "Jonathan will never sell the farm to you, Rickman." "I can be very persuasive when I want to," Bob said, a menacing gleam in his eyes. "How about a bet?" He extended his hand to Lex, as if expecting a deal. Lex ignored the gesture and instead of shaking Bob's hand, grabbed a champagne glass from a passing tray. "It's no fun betting on something I know I'm going to win," Lex said, raising the glass before taking a sip, keeping his gaze fixed on Bob. A female guest approached Bob, momentarily distracting him. "We'll see, Lex," Bob murmured, returning to his superior smile as he greeted the woman beside him. Lex, with his eyes locked, watched the interaction for a brief moment before stepping away, satisfied that he had shown he wouldn't be easily intimidated. As he distanced himself from the party, his thoughts turned to the Kents. Jonathan would never cave to pressure, but Rickman is dangerous, Lex thought, feeling a pang of concern. He needed to make sure the Kent family was aware of who Bob Rickman really was. "Maybe it's time to pay a visit to the Kent farm," Lex murmured to himself as he planned his next move. The sun was beginning to set on the Kent farm, and Clark was busy stacking bales of hay in the barn. The day had been long, but the physical work helped him focus. He stopped for a moment, glancing in the direction of a car approaching. Vroom. Clark looked toward the noise and recognized Lex's car. He dropped the bale of hay and walked toward the car, curious about the visit. What does he want now? Lex's car stopped in front of the house, and the door opened slowly. Lex got out with a serious air, but he maintained his usual calm smile when he saw Clark approaching. "Hey, Lex. To what do I owe the pleasure of your visit?" Clark said with a slight smile, but he could already sense that Lex wasn't just there for a casual chat. Lex closed the car door, adjusting his tie as he walked toward Clark. "Clark, I need to warn you about something. I just came from a reception with Bob Rickman, and he mentioned he's interested in your farm." Clark frowned for a moment, surprised. "Rickman? What does he want with the farm?" "He wants to build a pesticide factory here," Lex explained, his voice firm. "I know this guy, Clark. He's dangerous. He can be very persuasive, and trust me, he won't give up easily." Clark took a deep breath, but kept his expression calm. "Lex, you know my dad. He's never going to sell the farm, so you don't have to worry. Jonathan Kent isn't the kind to cave under that kind of pressure. I know your father is a strong man, but Rickman plays dirty. He's pressured people before, and believe me, he can go much further than we can imagine," Lex said, offering a small smile as he admired Clark's confidence. Clark nodded, realizing Lex was genuinely concerned. "Thanks for the warning, Lex. I'll talk to my dad about it. But honestly, I think Rickman is wasting his time here." Lex looked at Clark with a more serious expression. "I just want you to be prepared, Clark. Rickman isn't someone to be underestimated." "I'll remember your advice, Lex," Clark said in a calmer yet grateful tone. "Thanks for looking out for us." "I know you will, Clark," Lex said, heading back to his car. "But be careful. He could show up at any moment." Lex got into his car, started the engine, and gave Clark one last wave before driving off. Clark stood there for a moment, watching Lex's car disappear into the distance. Now it's just a matter of waiting for him to show up and deal with it. Clark took a deep breath, still thinking over Lex's words, before returning to his work in the barn. He knew that sooner or later, Rickman would try something, but he also knew his family was ready to face any challenge. Clark went back to stacking the hay bales, focusing again on the work but keeping his mind alert for what was to come. Kyle walked through the quiet streets of Smallville, the weight of his thoughts reflected in his serious expression. He knew that sooner or later, he would have to deal with Bob. Suddenly, he saw Bob himself coming out of a building ahead, his face lit up with a confident smile. Kyle quickened his pace and approached Bob, his voice tense. "Rickman, we made a deal 9 years ago. You promised you'd leave Smallville alone. I think it's time to honor that promise." Bob looked at Kyle, still smiling. "Kyle, things change. That deal, it was a good move back then, but now the interests are different. Smallville's in my way again, and I'm going to move forward with my plans." Kyle clenched his fists, holding back his anger. "You should leave Smallville while you still can." Bob chuckled, unfazed. "Do you really think you have any control over this? I suggest you think twice before making threats you can't back up." At that moment, Whitney walked out of the beanery and saw Kyle talking to Bob. He frowned, remembering Lana's accident, where Kyle had been involved. "Hey Kyle, what are you doing here?" "Stay away from Lana," Whitney said, his voice filled with frustration and anger. Bob, sensing the tension, smiled maliciously. He walked over to Whitney and extended his hand. "Whitney, right? Maybe you should handle this in a more decisive way." Still irritated, Whitney shook Bob's hand, not noticing the subtle green glow that surrounded their handshake. His eyes glazed over a little, and he turned sharply toward Kyle, who looked at him with suspicion. "You want to settle this right here, right now?" Whitney shouted, advancing toward Kyle, clearly agitated. Kyle, seeing Bob using his powers, raised his hands, trying to avoid the confrontation. "Calm down, kid. This has nothing to do with you." But Whitney wasn't listening anymore. He shoved Kyle hard, causing him to stumble backward. "Enough!" Whitney shouted, advancing again and landing a punch on Kyle's face. Kyle defended himself, but Whitney seemed out of control. The two started brawling in the middle of the street, exchanging punches and shoves. However, Whitney didn't have Kyle's experience and was quickly overpowered. Kyle pushed him to the ground, and Whitney hit his head hard on the pavement, becoming dizzy and vulnerable. Thud. Lana, who had been inside the beanery, came running out when she heard the noise. "Whitney!" she shouted, kneeling beside him as Kyle backed off, still breathing heavily. The police, who were nearby, quickly arrived on the scene, drawn by the commotion. One of the officers stepped out of the car and, without hesitation, arrested Kyle. "I was defending myself." Kyle tried to explain, but the officer, with a cold look, pushed him into the patrol car. Bob Rickman, with a satisfied smile, approached the officer. "Great job, officer," he said, extending his hand for a handshake. "I know people like Kyle don't deserve to be in society," Bob murmured as he shook the officer's hand. "You should take care of that, tonight." The officer's gaze became vacant for a moment, but he quickly nodded in agreement, without question. "I'll take care of it, Mr. Rickman," the officer replied, closing the patrol car door with Kyle inside. Bob smiled and turned away, walking calmly down the street as if everything was under control. Lana, still kneeling beside Whitney, waited for the ambulance to arrive, her eyes filled with worry. Clark was on the porch of his house, the night silent and peaceful. He gazed at the stars, letting his thoughts drift while feeling the soft breeze of the countryside. The day had been full, and he could finally relax for a few moments. Ding! The sound of a notification broke the silence, and Clark pulled his phone from his pocket. He saw it was a message from Lana. He opened the message quickly, curious about what she wanted to say. "Lana, Clark, I need to tell you what happened. Whitney ended up getting into a fight with Kyle today. It all happened so fast. I think it's connected to the accident I had with the horse earlier. He was so worried about me, and it seems like that pushed him out of control." Clark frowned as he read, concerned about what had happened. "Clark, I'm sorry for all of this, Lana. I hope Whitney will be okay. If you need anything, you know where to find me." After sending the message, Clark looked at the phone, expecting a quick reply. A few seconds later, a new message appeared on the screen. Lana, thanks, Clark. The ambulance already came, and he's being taken care of. I'm just worried. It feels like everything's going wrong lately. Clark quickly typed a few more supportive words, but inside, he was reflecting on what was going on. Clark, Lana, what about Kyle? What happened to him? Lana, the police took him. I don't know what's going to happen, but he was trying to defend himself. Everything is so confusing, Clark. Clark frowned as he read Lana's response, his concern now shifting to Kyle. Someone might try to kill him at the station. If Bob Rickman's involved, I can't trust that he's safe there. Clark quickly ended the conversation with Lana, sending one last message. Clark, stay calm, Lana. Everything will be fine. As soon as the conversation ended, Clark put his phone back in his pocket and in an instant, became invisible. Whoosh. Clark's super speed took him directly to the Smallville police station in a matter of seconds. He stopped outside the building, his body still invisible, and observed the activity inside. The station's still pretty busy. Getting Kyle out of here will be tricky at this hour. I'd better check the minds of the officers first. Clark concentrated, expanding his telepathy to read the minds of the officers inside the station. He needed to find out if any of them were already under Bob Rickman's influence and what plan might be unfolding. As he scanned the minds, he noticed that some officers were agitated, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, when he focused on one of the officers further away, Clark picked up disturbing fragments of thoughts. Clark approached the officer, still invisible, carefully observing his actions. The officer seemed restless, constantly checking his watch as if he were expecting something. Clark, focusing on the thoughts running through the officer's mind, sensed a dark suggestion implanted by Bob Rickman. You should take care of it tonight. Clark frowned, realizing that Bob had left a deep mark on the officer's mind. He needed to act quickly. This idea needs to disappear now. Clark lightly placed his hand on the officer's head, connecting his mind to the officer's. Slowly, he erased the thought of killing Kyle, removing every trace of Rickman's dangerous suggestion. With his mind cleared, Clark began to implant a new idea in the officer's mind, something that would make it easier for Kyle to be released from jail. The officer blinked a few times, as if waking up from a trance. This will take care of things for now. Now, I need to find Bob. Clark quickly left the police station, still invisible, moving swiftly outside the building. He knew the next task was to figure out where Bob Rickman was staying in Smallville. If I were a businessman with dirty intentions, where would I be? Clark began considering all the options. He sped through the town, still invisible, heading toward the more secluded mansions of Smallville. He knew there weren't any luxury hotels in town, so it was likely that Bob Rickman was staying in one of the more discreet properties, perhaps in the company of someone influential. Victoria Hardwick. She has resources and influence. Bob might be with her. Clark arrived at one of the large mansions in Smallville, a property known to belong to the Hardwick family. Clark entered the mansion, the surroundings exuding a sophisticated atmosphere. The dining room was set up for what looked like a romantic dinner. Soft lighting illuminated the table, which was impeccably set with fine dishes and crystal glasses. With Bob's powers of persuasion, it's unlikely any woman would turn him down, Clark thought as he observed the scene. Bob Rickman sat at the table, reaching out to Victoria Hardwick, who was across from him, finishing her glass of wine. Let's go to your room and seal the deal, Bob said in a suggestive tone. Victoria slowly stood up, adjusting her dress as she looked at him. You can stay in my house, Bob, she said with a cold smile. But nothing is going to happen between us. I'm interested in men bigger than you. Bob withdrew his hand, surprised by the rejection, but he kept a fake smile on his face. Victoria walked out of the dining room with firm steps, leaving Bob alone with his frustration. Clark watched everything from the side. That was fun to watch. Taking advantage of Victoria's absence, Clark approached Bob, still invisible. He reached out and touched Bob's head, connecting to his mind. Slowly, Clark erased all memories of Bob's powers of persuasion and the influence he had exerted over others. Now, he would be just another ordinary man. You will confess to all the environmental crimes you committed, Clark murmured in a firm tone, implanting the new order in Bob's mind. With a quick move, Clark used his heat vision to burn the palm of Bob's hand. Arg! Bob's scream echoed through the room as he clutched his burned hand, his face contorted in pain. Victoria came running back into the room upon hearing the scream, concern etched on her face. "What happened to you?" she asked, seeing Bob writhing in pain, holding his hand. Clark approached Victoria and, still invisible, placed his hand on her head. "He had an accident in the kitchen. You're going to help him, and while you're at it, stay away from Lex," Clark said, precisely shaping her thoughts. Victoria started picking up the phone, calling for an ambulance, while Bob continued to groan in pain. Clark watched the scene unfold and began to leave the mansion, satisfied with the outcome. As he walked away, his thoughts drifted to the past. Victoria Hardwick. If I remember correctly, at some point Lionel Luthor was going to sleep with her. "Consider this my gift to you, Lex. You won't need to know your father slept with your ex." With a discreet smile on his face, Clark left the mansion, his thoughts already elsewhere, while the night in Smallville remained calm. The next morning, the shrill sound of the phone broke the silence in Clark's bedroom. Ring. Ring. Clark picked up the phone from the bedside table and saw Lex's name on the screen. He answered quickly, still a bit groggy. "Clark, you don't need to worry about Bob Rickman anymore. He confessed to some crimes and won't be bothering your family again," Lex said on the other end of the line, his voice calm. Clark, who already knew exactly what had happened, kept his composure. "Thanks for letting me know, Lex. That's a relief for all of us." "But there's one more thing, Clark," Lex continued. "I want you in Metropolis on Saturday. We have a lot to discuss about you and your book." Clark smiled slightly, already expecting something like that. "Deal, Lex. I'll be there." After chatting a bit more and ironing out the details, Clark ended the call, glancing at the clock. "I have 2 days until Saturday," he murmured to himself, getting out of bed. He stretched and left the room, ready to start getting ready for another day at school. In the Torch newsroom, Clark sat next to Chloe, watching as she typed the final touches on an article she had written about Bob Rickman. "I was thinking about trying to get an interview with Lex for the Torch," Chloe said, without taking her eyes off the screen as her fingers flew across the keyboard. "The principal won't like seeing you report on things that have nothing to do with the school," Clark replied with a slight smile. Chloe chuckled, still focused on the computer. "It's all a matter of perspective, Clark." Clark laughed, shaking his head. "The only perspective that matters is the principal's. By the way, I haven't seen Pete around for a while." "Oh, Pete's happy as can be with Jody. The two of them are pretty much always together now," Chloe commented, giving the text one last look before saving the file. "At least he's happy, and that's what matters," Clark said, glancing at the computer screen. Chloe smiled and turned to Clark. "So, what did you think of the article about Bob Rickman?" "It's really good, Chloe," Clark responded, genuinely impressed with her work. The two continued talking about the article, laughing and discussing the details as Chloe put the final touches on the paper. Clark was driving back to the farm after a long day at school. The sky was starting to take on orange hues with the sunset, creating a peaceful atmosphere. As he neared the house, he noticed his father sitting on the porch, gazing at the sky with a distant expression. Clark parked the truck and got out slowly, watching Jonathan, who seemed absorbed in his thoughts. "What's wrong, Dad? You seem lost in thought," Clark said as he approached and sat next to him on the porch. Jonathan gave a faint smile, but clearly tried to brush it off. "Oh, nothing, son. Just thinking about a few things." Clark, realizing his father wasn't being completely honest, sighed as he subtly activated his telepathy. As he read Jonathan's mind, he picked up on the worries about the farm's finances. The weight of the debt was beginning to overwhelm his father. Clark let out a deeper sigh. "Dad, if money's the issue, I can fix it," Clark said, trying to offer a solution. Jonathan shook his head, firmly rejecting the offer. "Clark, no. I can't accept that. This farm has always been the livelihood of our family, and I won't let you take on that responsibility." "And what are you going to do, mortgage the farm?" "You can't let your pride cloud your judgment, Dad," Clark said, keeping his tone calm but firm. Jonathan looked at his son, considering what he had said. The silence between them was broken by a soft sigh from Jonathan, who finally began to consider Clark's proposal. "You won't give it to me, it'll be a loan," Jonathan said, conceding a little but maintaining his integrity. Clark smiled and stood up, giving his father a light pat on the shoulder. "All right, Dad. I'll arrange the bank transfers," Clark said, satisfied that he could help without hurting his father's pride. Clark went inside the house, where he was greeted by Martha's warm smile, clearly aware of the conversation between father and son. Martha looked at Clark with an approving gaze. "You're a good son, Clark," she said as she continued to prepare dinner. "Thanks, Mom. I'm just doing what I can to help," Clark said as he approached the kitchen counter, watching the meal Martha was preparing. "Dinner's almost ready. Can you call your dad, please?" Martha asked as she finished setting the table. Clark left the kitchen and went back to the porch, where Jonathan was still sitting, gazing at the horizon. "Dad, dinner's ready." Jonathan slowly stood up, still lost in thought, but with a smile on his face. "Let's go eat then." The two walked into the house, and soon the Kent family was gathered around the dinner table, sharing a meal and enjoying each other's company. "So Lex, what would you say to those who question your family's intentions in Smallville? Many believe that Luthor Corp's actions have caused more harm than good to the town." Chloe adjusted the microphone, her expression determined, while Clark focused the camera on Lex. The mansion's setting was elegant, but the tension between the question and the answer was palpable. Lex, with a controlled smile, was about to respond when one of the security guards entered the room hurriedly. "Mr. Luthor, we need your attention for a moment." "Excuse me, Chloe, Clark. I'll handle this quickly." Lex stood up, adjusting his suit before leaving the room. "You don't hold back with the questions, do you?" Clark said, looking at Chloe with a slight smile. "I'm a journalist, honey. If I'm not making people uncomfortable, I'm not doing my job right," Chloe responded, returning the smile as she reviewed her interview notes. Elsewhere, James Beals was driving frantically down the road, a large yellow flower on the seat beside him. He held the phone in one hand, his voice anxious as he tried to speak with Lionel Luthor. "It's urgent. I found something you need to see," James said, but Lionel's secretary wouldn't budge. "Sorry, Mr. Beals. Mr. Luthor is in a meeting. He can't take your call right now." "I don't have time for this," James yelled, before throwing the phone down in frustration and stepping on the gas. His eyes locked on a car ahead on the road. It was Jonathan Kent. He honked, flashed his headlights, and sped up toward him. Honk. Honk. Jonathan glanced in the rearview mirror, confused by James's aggressive behavior, and began trying to slow down. "Come on, what are you doing?" Jonathan muttered, trying to keep control. In a sudden fit of rage, James attempted to overtake Jonathan on the right along the narrow road, but ended up hitting an obstacle on the side. Crash. James's car flipped several times before coming to a stop on its side. Jonathan braked sharply, his heart racing. Without a second thought, he ran toward the overturned car, managing to drag James out just before the vehicle exploded into a ball of fire. Boom. Jonathan looked at James, panting and relieved. However, before he could react, the large yellow flower from the car struck him in the face. Whoosh. Jonathan recoiled, surprised and confused, as he held the flower, which now lay on the ground. Clark was driving back to the farm after dropping Chloe off at her house. The interview with Lex had gone well, though there was always a sense that more was happening behind the scenes. The sound of the truck's engine filled the silence of the road as the sun began to set. When he arrived at the farm, Clark parked the truck near the house and slowly got out, enjoying the cool evening air. As he entered through the front door, he noticed something strange. There were muffled laughs coming from the kitchen. Clark frowned, curious, and quietly approached. When he peeked through the kitchen door, his eyes widened as he saw his parents kissing passionately, with Martha sitting on the table and Jonathan's hands on her waist. Clark whistled loudly, trying to get their attention. Jonathan quickly pulled away, and Martha straightened up as well, adjusting her hair with a slightly embarrassed smile. "Mom. Dad. I'm home," Clark said, trying to hide his discomfort, avoiding looking directly at them. "Oh, Clark, you're home," Martha said, blushing slightly as she tried to compose herself. Jonathan, on the other hand, seemed less embarrassed and even a little amused by the situation. He playfully slapped Martha's backside, causing her to let out a small yelp. "Hey!" Martha exclaimed, with an embarrassed smile. "You're awfully inconvenient, Clark, interrupting your old man's fun," Jonathan said, smiling and winking at Clark. Clark, not knowing what to say, just rolled his eyes and began heading upstairs, trying to ignore what he had just seen. "I didn't see anything. I didn't see anything," he murmured to himself as he climbed the stairs. As soon as Clark disappeared upstairs, Jonathan approached Martha with a playful smile. "Let's pick up where we left off, dear," he whispered teasingly. The kitchen soon became quiet again, except for the sound of them resuming their kissing. Dr. Hamilton arrived at Luther Mansion with quick steps, carrying an urgent expression on his face. He entered Lex's office, where the young Luther was reviewing some documents, and spoke directly, without preamble. "James Beals stole one of my flowers after helping me with the equipment," Hamilton said, crossing his arms. Lex looked up, clearly confused. "Flowers? What's so important about those flowers that he would steal one?" "They're not just any flowers," Dr. Hamilton explained, his voice serious. "The Nicodemus flower has been extinct for 100 years. I used meteorite fragments to irradiate the dormant seeds and bring the flower back to life." "I didn't invest my money for you to bring flowers back to life," Lex said, not hiding his frustration as he closed the file he was reviewing. "There are steps that must be followed, and the flowers are an important part of that process," Dr. Hamilton replied. Lex sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Where is James Beals now?" "James Beals was in an accident and nearly died. Luckily, a passerby was there at the exact moment and saved him," Dr. Hamilton explained. "Let me guess, Clark Kent saved him," Lex said with an ironic smile. "No," Dr. Hamilton replied, shaking his head. "It was his father, Jonathan Kent." Lex smiled, intrigued by the coincidence, as he leaned back in his chair and looked at Dr. Hamilton with a thoughtful expression. "So the Kent's fate continues to intertwine with mine in unexpected ways." Dr. Hamilton frowned, not understanding what Lex was thinking. "What are you going to do, Lex?" Hamilton asked cautiously. "The Nicodemus flower is extremely dangerous. It can alter people's behavior and lead them to do reckless things." Lex crossed his arms, deep in thought. "First, we need to make sure that flower doesn't fall into the wrong hands. If Jonathan Kent touched it, we might be facing a bigger problem." Hamilton nodded, but there was an uneasiness in his expression. He knew the experiments with the Nicodemus flower could have serious consequences, but he wasn't sure how Lex intended to handle it. "I'll go to the Kent farm to check on Jonathan personally," Lex said, already standing up. "If there are any effects from the flower, I'll need to intervene." Hamilton shook his head, worried, but he knew Lex wouldn't be easily dissuaded. "If Jonathan is affected, he could become dangerous," Hamilton warned. "The flower amplifies emotions and behaviors. He could be unpredictable." Lex nodded. "I know. That's why we need to act fast." Without further words, Lex left the room, determined to resolve yet another issue involving the Kents and now the mysterious Nicodemus flower. Clark walked down the stairs slowly, still reflecting on what he had seen and trying to clear his mind of the scene he witnessed between his parents. When he reached the living room, he saw Jonathan in the kitchen, opening the fridge with a serious expression. He took out a beer and, without much thought, wiped the bottle on the curtains instead of using a towel. Clark frowned, realizing something was off about his father's behavior. "Dad, are you okay?" Clark asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Jonathan took a swig of the beer before answering, his voice a bit sharper than usual. "You want to watch the football game with me?" Jonathan turned to Clark, the beer bottle in hand, already heading toward the living room. "We can forget about all these chores for a while, don't you think?" Clark observed his father's behavior. Something was definitely off. He decided to use his powers to read Jonathan's mind. As he delved into his thoughts, he saw the memory of his father coming into contact with an unusual flower. "So that's what's affecting my dad." Suddenly, Clark heard a familiar sound in the distance. With his super hearing, he picked up the noise of a car approaching down the dirt road leading to the farm. Vroom! Clark quickly turned toward the window and saw Lex Luthor's black car pulling up in front of the house. Lex stepped out of the car, dressed in his typical impeccable suit and with a serious expression on his face. He walked firmly toward the house, clearly determined to speak with Jonathan. Clark sighed, knowing this probably wouldn't end well, considering his father's condition. Knock, knock. Lex knocked on the door, and Clark was the first to answer, with a worried expression. He opened the door to find Lex looking slightly surprised to see Clark's face. "Clark," Lex said, with a smile that tried to soften the tension. "I came to check on your dad after the incident with the Nicodemus flower." Clark nodded, concerned. "He's different. The flower clearly affected him." At that moment, Jonathan appeared in the kitchen doorway, still holding the beer in his hand. He looked at Lex with a contained rage, and his posture indicated he wasn't in the mood to be polite. "Ah, of course. The Luthor heir shows up to see how we're doing after yet another one of your messes," Jonathan said, his tone sarcastic and aggressive as he walked toward Lex with firm steps. "Jonathan, I just came to make sure you're okay," Lex responded, remaining calm but clearly worried about Jonathan's behavior. "Okay? You want to know if I'm okay, Luthor? The truth is, I hate all the Luthors," Jonathan shouted, his voice rising as he moved closer to Lex. "You're a cancer in this town. Luthor Corp does more harm than good, and you're just like your father. I've never trusted any of you." "Jonathan, I understand you're upset, but I'm not my father," Lex said, still trying to maintain his composure. "I'm here to help." "You don't understand anything." Jonathan took another step forward, but Clark stepped between them, trying to defuse the situation. "Dad, I think you need to rest a bit," Clark said, trying to guide Jonathan away from Lex. Jonathan looked at Clark, visibly irritated, but after a few seconds, he backed off, letting out a frustrated sigh. "Maybe you're right. I'll take a nap," Jonathan said, turning and heading toward his room, still muttering under his breath. Clark sighed in relief. "That was intense," Lex said, breaking the silence. "I know," Clark replied. "Sorry for my dad's behavior. He's not usually like this." "Don't worry, Clark," Lex said with a gentle smile. "I understand. We'll talk later." Lex drove away, and Clark watched as the vehicle quickly disappeared down the road. "Now I'd better resolve my dad's issues quickly. It's not good to rely too much on the storyline." Using his super speed, Clark ran to the highway where the accident had occurred. "Finally, here it is," Clark murmured as he crouched down and picked up the fallen flower. With the flower in hand, Clark sped to Dr. Hamilton's lab. Clark arrived at the lab and, without wasting any time, entered the building. Inside, the place was chaotic, with papers scattered around and scientific equipment in every corner. The soft hum of a machine echoed in the background, but Clark was focused on one thing: solving his dad's problem. He ran to Hamilton, who was absorbed in his research. "Make the cure," Clark said, firmly gripping Hamilton's head. Hamilton, surprised and terrified, looked up at Clark and, without question, took the flower he brought. Silently, he began his work, retrieving the necessary equipment to extract the Nicodemus flower's antidote. He worked quickly, his hands trembling, while Clark watched him closely. The sound of vials being opened and syringes being filled resonated through the lab. FSSS. After a few minutes of concentration, Hamilton finished the process and handed Clark a small case containing several syringes with the antidote. "Destroy your research. Burn down the lab. You won't remember that I was here, and you will give up researching anything related to kryptonite in the future." Still under Clark's control, Hamilton nodded in agreement, without hesitation. Clark left the lab at super speed, the sound of his steps practically inaudible. Whoosh. Back at the farm, Clark was determined to save his father and ensure that the effects of the Nicodemus flower wouldn't cause any more problems. Jonathan was sitting on the porch of the house, clearly irritated. He looked at Clark, frowning as he gripped the beer bottle harder than usual. "Kid, where have you been? You left without telling anyone. Your mother's worried. I should give you a beating," Jonathan shouted, his voice full of frustration. Clark ignored his father's words and slowly approached. He knew Jonathan's anger wasn't normal and that he had to act quickly to end the flower's effects. Clark stood in front of Jonathan, remaining calm. Without saying a word, he opened the small case containing the syringes he'd gotten from Dr. Hamilton. With precision, he took one of the syringes and prepared to inject the antidote into his father. Jonathan looked at Clark in confusion, but before he could react, Clark had already injected the antidote into his arm. Jonathan's eyes widened as he tried to resist what was happening, but soon his body gave in. He fainted, falling softly into Clark's arms. Clark picked up his father, sighing in relief that he had managed to act in time. He carried him inside the house carefully, ready to ensure that Jonathan would fully recover from the flower's effects. Inside, Clark laid Jonathan down on the couch, adjusting him with care. Martha, who had been in the kitchen, ran into the living room upon seeing the scene. "Clark, what happened to your father?" "I took care of everything, Mom. He'll be fine now," Clark said, looking at Martha with a soft smile. Martha exhaled deeply, relieved. Thank God. I was so worried. Clark sat beside Jonathan, watching him rest. He knew the flower's effects would soon wear off and that things would finally return to normal on the farm. The next morning, Lana was nervous as she prepared for her presentation to Lex. Her folders with reports were neatly organized, and she mentally reviewed each point she wanted to cover. When she arrived at Luthor Mansion, Lex greeted her and guided her to his office. I'm curious to hear what you've prepared, Lana. Feel free to start whenever you're ready. Lana took a deep breath, adjusting the papers in her hands before she began speaking. Lex, I did some research on local tax incentives and how to revitalize the Talon. I believe we could turn it into much more than just a regular theater. My proposal is to create a space that's simultaneously a cafe, a bookstore, and a community gathering spot, with local bands performing and art films being shown. She looked at Lex, waiting for his reaction, but he simply nodded, encouraging her to continue. The Talon has historical value for Smallville, and I think with the right investment, we can turn it into a profitable business while making it culturally significant. It's a place that could attract both locals and tourists. Lex kept his eyes on Lana, clearly impressed with how much thought she had put into the project. You've done an excellent job, Lana. The idea is solid, and what you're proposing is exactly the kind of enterprise Smallville needs. Lana smiled, feeling relieved and excited by Lex's positive response. I accept your proposal, Lex said, leaning forward slightly with a smile. But I want you to see this as a partnership. The two of us working together to make the Talon the best place in town. Lana's smile faded slightly when she heard the word partnership. She tried to hide her concern, but Lex noticed the change in her expression. Is something wrong, Lana? Lex asked, tilting his head, clearly curious. No, nothing. I'm just processing it all, she replied, trying to keep her composure. Lex smiled again, standing up and extending his hand to Lana. Trust me, Lana. We'll make this work together. Lana looked at Lex's hand for a moment before shaking it, still with a slight feeling of uncertainty. I know, Lex. Thank you for believing in the project, she said, trying to push aside the troubling thoughts that had begun to creep into her mind. As Lana left the mansion, her thoughts swirled around how this partnership with Lex could change things in her life. She wanted so badly for the Talon to succeed, but she knew that working with Lex Luthor meant stepping into a much more complicated world than she had imagined. Clark came down the stairs and found his parents in the kitchen. Jonathan was sitting at the table, holding a cup of coffee with his head down. The atmosphere seemed calm, but there was something different in the air. Good morning, Dad. Did you wake up feeling okay? Jonathan remained silent for a few seconds, not lifting his gaze from the coffee cup. Dad. Jonathan finally raised his eyes, looking a bit confused. Yes, son. I'm just a little disoriented and have a terrible headache, Jonathan replied, his voice tired as he rubbed his forehead. Martha, who was preparing breakfast, approached Jonathan and gently hugged him from behind, trying to comfort him. We'll go to the hospital later, sweetheart. Just to make sure everything is fine, Martha said in a calm but firm tone. Clark nodded, grabbing an apple from the fruit bowl before getting ready to leave. Okay, Mom. I'm heading to school, but let me know if you need anything. Martha smiled slightly, watching her son leave. We'll let you know, Clark. Take care. Clark gave one last look at Jonathan, still concerned, but left for school. Later, Lex drove his car down the road leading to Dr. Hamilton's lab. He had known something was wrong since their last conversation. When he arrived at the lab, he was surprised to see a thick column of smoke rising from the building. This isn't right. Lex quickly parked the car and ran toward the lab. Upon entering, he found the place completely burned. The smell of soot and melted materials filled the air. All of Hamilton's equipment was destroyed, and most of the papers had been reduced to ashes. Who did this? Lex muttered as he looked around, trying to understand what had happened. In the midst of the chaos, he saw Dr. Hamilton, his face marked by frustration, staring at the wreckage. He looked tired, defeated, but there was a determination in his eyes that Lex hadn't expected to see. Dr. Hamilton, what happened here? Lex asked, trying to remain calm despite the evident destruction. It's over, Lex. It's all over, Hamilton said without looking directly at him. I burned everything. I'm not going to continue with this research. Never again. Lex frowned, surprised by the confession. You did this? Why? You were so close to important discoveries. Hamilton finally looked at Lex, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and anger. Because I went too far. What I was doing wasn't natural. And you know it. These kryptonite experiments. What they can cause. I don't want to be involved anymore. Lex stepped forward, trying to convince Hamilton to reconsider. You're making a mistake. This research is essential, Dr. Hamilton. You have a brilliant mind. You can't just give up. I won't subject myself to this, Lex. Hamilton shouted, his voice echoing through the ruined lab. You can threaten me all you want, but I won't go back to kryptonite research. Never again. Lex remained silent for a moment, clearly frustrated. He hadn't expected this reaction from Hamilton. He knew the scientist was afraid, but he believed Hamilton's ambition and curiosity would keep him going. But now, it was clear the man was determined to stop. Lex clenched his fists in frustration. Do you understand what you're giving up, don't you? This is much bigger than you can imagine. Hamilton shook his head, visibly exhausted. I know. And that's why I'm done. Without another word, Lex turned and left the lab, visibly frustrated. He got into his car, and as he drove back to the mansion, his thoughts were racing. This won't end like this. The morning sun illuminated the hallways of Smallville High, which were decorated with colorful posters and banners for the class president campaign. Clark and Chloe walked side by side as he tried to process what Chloe had just told him about Pete and Jody. I can't believe they broke up, Clark said, looking surprised at Chloe. They seemed to be doing fine. Chloe shrugged, not taking her eyes off the camera she was carrying. Not everyone is like us, Clark. Some people just can't make it work. Clark shook his head, still deep in thought. I just hope Pete's okay with it. He seemed so excited about the relationship. He'll be fine, Clark, Chloe said confidently. But for now, maybe we should avoid bringing it up. Clark nodded in agreement as they continued walking through the bustling hallways. They exited the front door of the school and headed outside, where the fresh air surrounded them. Chloe and Clark walked toward where Pete was, leaning against a table, watching the class president candidates. The students around them were busy preparing posters and discussing strategies, making the atmosphere even more energetic. Hey Pete, who do you think has the best chance of winning? Chloe asked as she approached him, adjusting the camera. Felice Chandler has a good chance of winning, Pete said, staring at the candidate while she talked with some classmates. She's hot. Chloe raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by his response. Really, Pete? That's your reason? Pete shrugged, a mischievous smile on his face. You know how it is, Chloe. Sometimes popularity counts more than anything else. And in her case, well, there are other perks. Clark observed Pete for a moment, but his eyes soon drifted to Sasha Woodman, who was on the other side of the yard, preparing her campaign materials. He knew Sasha had something unusual about her, especially with her ability to control bees. Can I erase her memories without getting close? I've never tried doing that from a distance, Clark thought, concentrating deeply on Sasha. He focused his mind on her, trying to access her memories and manipulate her thoughts from afar, something he had never attempted before. Clark felt a faint connection form, but something seemed off. Suddenly, Sasha turned pale, her hands trembling as she struggled to stay balanced. Then, in an instant, Sasha collapsed, falling hard to the ground. Thud. The sound of her body hitting the ground echoed in the yard, and quickly, all the students around her gathered in a worried crowd, whispering about what could have happened. Someone call the nurse. One of the students yelled, clearly panicked. Clark, hiding his reaction, watched the scene carefully. He knew his experiment had gone out of control, but he couldn't show that. That was strange, Chloe murmured, looking at Sasha lying on the ground. She was fine just a moment ago. Clark frowned, keeping a concerned expression to avoid suspicion. Clark quickly approached the crowd around Sasha, noticing that chaos was starting to take over the situation. Give her some air, make space. Clark said firmly, pushing the students who were crowding around her. The group of students hesitated for a moment but soon started to move back, clearing a path for Clark to get closer to Sasha. She's breathing, but she probably passed out from the heat, Clark said, looking at the students around him, trying to ease any excessive worry. Heat? But it's not that hot, Pete muttered as he got closer. Clark glanced at Pete, keeping a serious expression. Even so, it might have been enough to affect her. Let's get the nurse just to be sure. Lisa, the school nurse, arrived quickly, gently pushing some students aside to make room. Excuse me, everyone, give us some space. Let me take a look at her, Lisa said, kneeling next to Sasha and beginning first aid. She checked Sasha's vital signs and frowned, realizing that the fainting seemed more serious than just a heat episode. Someone, please help me carry her to the nurse's office, Lisa said, looking around, clearly asking for assistance in moving Sasha safely. Clark saw the perfect opportunity and, without hesitation, volunteered. I can carry her, Clark said, lifting Sasha in his arms carefully, as if she were light as a feather. As he walked toward the nurse's office, he kept a calm expression, but inside, he was focused on fixing what he had done. Gently, Clark placed his hand on Sasha's head as he carried her. He delved back into her mind, adjusting the connections and memories he had altered. During this process, he also managed to see where the bees she controlled were hidden and ensured that, from now on, Sasha would compete for the presidency honestly, without relying on her powers. Even if it limited her chances of winning, it would be the fair way to compete. With this, she should wake up feeling much better and won't want to hurt anyone. When Clark reached the nurse's office, Sasha began to slowly open her eyes. Clark. Sasha murmured, still groggy but recognizing his presence. Lisa, the nurse, who was ahead, looked at Clark. Lay her down, Clark, Lisa said, pointing to one of the available beds. Clark gently placed Sasha on the bed, making sure she was comfortable. Sasha, you're okay now. We'll monitor you for a while, but it looks like it was just a fainting spell, Lisa said, already checking Sasha's vitals again. Sasha looked around, still a little confused but clearly relieved. She glanced at Clark, who was watching her with a supportive smile. Thanks, Clark. I don't know what happened, Sasha said, trying to understand what had occurred. Clark just shook his head, keeping a calm tone. You'll be fine. Just rest for a bit now. Sasha nodded, closing her eyes again as Lisa continued taking care of her. After leaving the nurse's office, Clark headed to the school bathroom, making sure he was alone. He knew there was still more to be done, and with a deep breath, he activated his invisibility. The air around him seemed to vibrate as his body disappeared completely. Now, I need to fix the rest of the problem. With his super speed, Clark left the school in an invisible blur, racing through the streets of Smallville until he arrived at Sasha's house. The wind blew softly as he stopped in front of the property, observing everything around him. The sound of buzzing bees filled the air, and Clark quickly located the shed, which was completely overrun with beehives. So this is where they're hiding. Clark focused his mind on the bees, using his telekinesis to control the environment around him. He concentrated his power, feeling the buzzing of the bees in his mind, like a faint vibration. With a slight gesture of his invisible hand, he began to compress the air around the bees. FSSSHH. The sound of bees being crushed echoed through the area as Clark used his telekinesis to eliminate them all at once. Within seconds, the hives were destroyed, and the yard was free of the swarm that had once posed a threat. Clark moved quickly, leaving Sasha's house without a trace, satisfied with the result. At super speed, he returned to the school, preparing to face the rest of the day, knowing he had solved yet another problem without raising any suspicions. Lana sat at one of the tables in the Talon, watching the empty space. The chairs were neatly arranged, and the place was spotless after the recent renovation Lex had funded. However, there was no one there besides her. I need to do something to attract more customers, Lana murmured to herself, her tone determined but with a hint of sadness. Lana sighed deeply, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The Talon was a special place for her, a symbol of her connection to Smallville, but lately, the Beanery had been trying to push them out of business. The competing cafe was becoming more and more popular, and the Talon, even after the renovation, seemed unable to compete. She looked over at the counter, where the employees also seemed disheartened. The Talon, which had once been a vibrant gathering place for the town, now seemed to have lost its spark. The recent modernization done by Lex had made the place more elegant, but the lack of customers made it clear that something was wrong. When school ended, Clark was driving Chloe home in the truck. The engine hummed softly as they cruised through the streets of Smallville. So you decided to support Paolo-chan for class president? Clark asked, not hiding the surprise in his voice. Chloe gave a slight smile. He's the most qualified, Clark. Plus, he has good ideas for the school. Clark nodded, still thoughtful. He also thought Paolo was a good candidate, but the surprise remained. As they arrived at Chloe's house, he parked the truck and looked at her quickly. Remember, you're a guest at the publisher's party tomorrow, right? Clark asked, a slight note of concern in his voice. Chloe, already grabbing her bag, responded confidently, I know how to separate the personal from the professional, Clark. Don't worry. Clark smiled, but inside, he knew that wasn't entirely true. I believe in you, he said, with a touch of irony, before waving goodbye. See you. See you tomorrow, Clark, Chloe replied, getting out of the truck and heading inside. Clark watched her house for a few more seconds, reflecting on the conversation. Then, he started the engine again and drove back to the farm. Clark was looking outside the bookstore, observing the busy crowd. The line to get in was long, with many parents holding books, accompanied by excited children. Some teenagers were chatting among themselves, while a few adults waited alone, all eager for the book signing event. Nervous about your book signing, Clark? Lex asked, approaching Clark with a calm smile, although his eyes betrayed a slight concern. No, just surprised by the crowd, Clark replied, keeping a serene expression, although the number of people did impress him. Click. Chloe lowered the camera, with a mischievous smile on her face. I guess I'll have to get used to my boyfriend's popularity. Clark gave her a playful look. In a relationship, you have to make concessions about a lot of things. Miss, I know how to separate personal from professional, he replied, with a teasing smile, recalling their previous conversation. Noticing the moment between the two, Lex gestured to Clark. Let's take a picture for the Inquisitor, Lex suggested, already joined by a journalist who was ready to capture the moment. Clark quickly waved to Chloe before following Lex to the journalist. He knew this was just one of many camera moments he would have to face. Click. 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 That's all for now, Mr. Luther, the journalist said, satisfied with the shots. Clark followed Lex to the table where he would be signing books. The table was nicely decorated, with several photos of Clark holding the book, along with a prominent illustration of Harry Potter, drawing the attention of passers-by. The atmosphere was lively, with everyone anticipating the start of the event. Chloe stood nearby, smiling and adjusting her camera. Go ahead and sit down, Clark. I'll talk to security to open the doors, Lex said in a commanding tone before leaving to inform the guards. Clark sat down, settling into the chair and surveying the room. Try to smile, Clark. Every time you talk to someone. And stop making that bored expression. You have a nice smile, Chloe teased, but with a hint of sincerity. Clark smiled, a little more relaxed. Smack. Clark playfully slapped Chloe's backside, quick and unexpected. Ouch. What was that for? Chloe said, not really angry, but surprised. Nothing in particular, I just felt like it, Clark replied with a mischievous grin. Save your feeling like it for when we're alone, Chloe responded, raising an eyebrow, trying to keep the playful tone. Clark smiled, saying nothing more, but the glint in his eyes showed that he enjoyed the interaction. At that moment, the security guards opened the doors, and a steady stream of people began to enter, guided by the guards toward the table where Clark sat. He smiled at each person who approached, signing books and answering casual questions. Do you know what's going to happen in the next book? An excited child asked, their eyes shining with curiosity. Maybe, but you'll have to wait to find out, Clark replied with a smile, handing back the signed book. Time passed, and the questions kept coming, mostly varying between curiosity about the future of the characters and theories about the next book. Clark kept the pace, always responding with a smile and trying to maintain the mystery. Kids are really persistent. After 30 minutes of signing books and answering questions, the line finally started to thin. Clark relaxed for a brief moment, when he noticed a young woman approaching. She seemed to be around his age, and her delicate features caught his attention. The girl handed him the book, and Clark opened the copy to sign it, but before he could do anything, she surprised him with an unusual question. Do you think magic is real? The question caught him off guard, but he kept a mischievous smile on his face. Yes, it's real. You need magic to write a book as fantastic as this. However, the girl didn't seem satisfied with the answer. Her eyes showed a hint of disappointment. Clark sensed the discomfort and tried to ease the moment. "Who should I make the autograph out to?" "Zatanna Zatara," the girl replied without hesitation. Clark froze for a second, his eyes lifting in surprise. He recognized that name. Zatanna Zatara, the famous magician, daughter of John Zatara. The surprise was clear, but he kept his composure as he continued the autograph. Zatanna looked directly at him, a slightly arrogant tone in her voice. "Recognize the name Zatara?" Clark, without losing control, calmly responded as he signed the book. "Yes, I do. But there are people waiting in line. We can talk later." Despite the casual tone, Clark knew this conversation would resume later, and his curiosity grew. Zatanna discreetly handed Chloe a card, who was standing beside them, observing everything intently. "I left my contact with your assistant. See you later, Clark." Chloe was clearly uncomfortable with the comment. She was Clark's girlfriend, not his assistant, and the way Zatanna had addressed her deeply bothered her. However, Clark seemed oblivious to Chloe's discomfort, focused on keeping the autograph session going. Zatanna took the book and left the line, while Chloe watched the scene with slight irritation. Clark, however, continued his work, unaware of the tension. Another hour passed, and finally, the event came to an end. Clark felt relieved when the last fan left the line, and he could relax a bit. Lex approached, smiling with satisfaction. "Good job, Clark. Now you can head back to the hotel and rest. See you tonight." Clark nodded, already feeling tired but grateful for Lex's impeccable organization. He glanced at Chloe, who was still holding Zatanna's card. "Let's go, Chloe. I think we're done here for today." Chloe, still a bit irritated, gave a faint smile and followed him toward the exit of the bookstore. "Are you okay, Chloe?" Clark finally noticed that something was wrong. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's just, assistant?" "Really?" she replied, with slight irritation. "Maybe you should get a tattoo on your forehead that says Clark's girlfriend," Clark said with a playful smile, looking at Chloe. Clearly annoyed, Chloe stomped on Clark's foot and quickened her pace toward the car. Clark, feeling nothing, just watched as she walked away, a slight smile on his face. I guess she didn't like that joke. He calmly followed her, already anticipating that he'd have to smooth things over later. When they arrived at the hotel room, Chloe went straight to the bathroom, leaving her things on the bed without saying a word. Clark watched in silence, realizing that she was still upset about the earlier interaction with Zatanna. Clark approached the bed and picked up the card Zatanna had left with Chloe. He flipped it between his fingers, reading the name and phone number elegantly written. Zatanna Zatara was engraved in gold letters, with a mystical symbol beside it. Her father must still be alive. I should have tried reading her mind, but it could be dangerous for me. She might have some defensive magic. Chloe came out, drying her hands on a towel and giving him a curious look. "Aren't you going to call her?" Clark looked at Chloe, realizing this wasn't the time for jokes. He set the card aside, walking calmly over to her. "I have much better things to do than think about Zatanna right now," Clark said in a suggestive tone, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her closer. Chloe looked up surprised, but didn't resist as Clark held her tightly, making it clear that the only person on his mind at that moment was her. The hotel room was silent, and the closeness between them made the air feel heavier. Clark kissed her gently, letting the tension from the earlier conversation fade away. He knew that Zatanna and the mystery surrounding her could wait. Right now, he was entirely focused on Chloe, his hands sliding down her waist as time seemed to stop around them. Lana sat at the talon counter, stirring her coffee, with a satisfied smile on her face. She couldn't help but feel a sense of relief and, at the same time, triumph. The talon, which had seemed to be losing the battle against the beanery, was now on the verge of an important turnaround. The beanery has several health code violations. When that comes out in the Smallville ledger tomorrow, they'll practically be forced to shut down, Lana murmured to herself, looking out the window at the calm street. She admitted, with a small smile, that she had enjoyed finding a way to secure the talon's success. Playing dirty had never been something she thought she'd do, but in this situation, it was necessary. The talon meant so much to her, and seeing the beanery try to push it out of the market had left her desperate for a solution. "I'm just making sure my business survives. Nothing wrong with that. The newspaper wouldn't be published until tomorrow. but Lana could already feel that the Talon's future was safer. She stood up, grabbing her purse and preparing to close the cafe. The Talon was quiet that night, but the emptiness now felt like the calm before the storm of customers she expected in the coming days. Night had fallen, and the city of Metropolis was aglow with the lights of buildings and the bustle of the streets. Clark and Chloe were ready to go out, both dressed elegantly. Chloe wore a black dress that accentuated her figure, while Clark sported a perfectly fitted suit. They were in a light-hearted mood, ready to celebrate the success of the book and the publishing house. Clark held Chloe's hand gently as they prepared to leave the hotel room. "Are you ready?" he asked, admiring her. "You look beautiful." "Thank you, Clark. You're not looking too bad yourself," Chloe replied with a touch of humor as she moved closer to him. "Shall we? I want to savor every second of this night." The two left the hotel and took a taxi to the restaurant where the gala dinner would be held. The place was sophisticated, with illuminated facades and an elegant ambience that set the stage for a special occasion. Upon arrival, Clark paid the driver and helped Chloe out of the car. "I'm sure we're going to love this place. Lex personally recommended it," Clark said as he led Chloe to the entrance. As soon as they entered, they were greeted by a waiter who guided them to a table by the window, offering a privileged view of the city lights. Clark pulled out a chair for Chloe to sit, then took a seat across from her. "I still can't believe the scale of this book's success," Chloe said, looking around, admiring the surroundings. "It was amazing to see so many people excited about something you created, Clark. Who'd have thought a book about an orphaned wizard would be so popular?" Clark gave an ironic smile, resting his elbow on the table and looking at Chloe with a gleam of sarcasm in his eyes. "Oh, don't be modest. You know you've got talent, even if you don't like to admit it." Chloe gave a soft smile, taking an appetizer from a passing tray, but never breaking her gaze at Clark, as if expecting him to concede. "If only she knew I copied the entire book, she wouldn't think that way. Maybe I should have written about vampires in love. That might have been even more successful." He chuckled lightly, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms with a carefree air. "You know, some people would pay a fortune to read it, no matter the theme. They're interested in who wrote it, Clark." Chloe raised her gaze, blinking at him, trying to bring a bit of humor to the moment. "Oh, I see. So maybe I should do a dramatic autobiography. Asterisk my life as a country boy. Hating the big city. Asterisk what do you think?" He laughed, but the tone was clearly a blend of jest and sarcasm as he looked out the window, the metropolis lights reflecting in his eyes. "I think you're more than that, Kent. You're a walking mystery, and people love mysteries." She smiled fondly, holding his hand across the table. Suddenly, Lex appeared beside them with a friendly smile on his face. "Clark, would you mind joining me for a moment? I'd like to introduce you to some important people." Lex sounded confident, but there was a hint of urgency in his voice. Clark looked at Chloe and smiled. "I'll be right back, okay?" Chloe nodded, smiling back. "I'll stay here and enjoy the view. Go on, impress them." Clark stood up and followed Lex across the room. They walked over to a group of well-dressed people who were chatting animatedly near the bar. Lex approached, drawing the group's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to Clark Kent, the author of the book everyone's been talking about recently," Lex announced, with a confident smile as he placed a hand on Clark's shoulder. The group turned to face Clark, and he noticed how their expressions changed immediately. Polite smiles appeared on their faces, and handshakes were quickly extended. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Kent. Lex has told us a lot about you," one of the men said, shaking Clark's hand firmly but quickly. "The book is truly fascinating. Lex mentioned how hard you worked on it," a woman said with a smile that seemed almost rehearsed. Clark realized that although they were being cordial, their interest wasn't genuine. They were there because of Lex, not because of the book. Nonetheless, Clark didn't mind. He kept his composure, smiling and responding politely, thanking them for their compliments, even knowing they were motivated by Lex's influence. Lex, on the other hand, seemed pleased with the attention Clark was receiving. He made sure to emphasize LuthorCorp's support for the book and how much he believed in Clark's potential as an author. After a few minutes of conversation, Lex leaned over to Clark and said, "Thanks for coming, Clark. I think we made a good impression, which is great for all of us." Clark just nodded, keeping his smile. "Of course, Lex. I'm always happy to help." Lex gave a light pat on Clark's shoulder before stepping away, returning to mingle with others in the room. Clark, for his part, decided to head back to where Chloe was seated, relieved that the interaction was over. When he returned to the table, Chloe looked at him curiously. "So, how was it?" Clark shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "It was interesting. I think they were more impressed that I know Lex than with the book itself." Chloe smiled, shaking her head. "Well, they don't know what they're missing. To me, you're the real star of the night." Clark sat back down, taking Chloe's hand across the table. "Thank you, Chloe. That's all I needed to hear." They shared a tender look as soft music played in the background, and the rest of the evening continued peacefully until an unexpected figure appeared at the restaurant door. Lionel Luthor entered, his piercing gaze sweeping the room until it landed on Lex and Clark. Lex immediately noticed his father's presence and didn't look pleased at all. "What are you doing here, Dad?" Lex muttered through gritted teeth, keeping a forced smile for the guests around him. Unfazed, Lionel walked over to Lex, stopping beside the group. "I couldn't miss the chance to congratulate the publisher and of course young author Clark Kent," he said, with a tone that seemed to mix sincerity and sarcasm. Lex kept his smile, but his expression clearly indicated his discomfort with his father's presence. "Everything is going as planned, Dad. You didn't need to worry." Lionel gave Lex a light pat on the shoulder, keeping his sharp gaze fixed. "I'm sure it is, son. I'm very proud of what you've achieved here. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to congratulate a certain young writer." Lionel stepped away from Lex, who continued to watch with a look of disdain as his father walked toward Clark's table. Lionel arrived at Clark and Chloe's table, a warm smile on his face but with a calculating gleam in his eyes. "Clark Kent, it's a pleasure to finally meet you in person," Lionel said, extending his hand to Clark. "I must say, the book is impressive. You did an incredible job." Clark stood up and shook Lionel's hand, trying to hide his surprise. "Thank you, Mr. Luthor. I'm glad you enjoyed it." Lionel nodded, then looked at Chloe and greeted her with a slight nod. "And who is this charming companion?" Chloe forced a smile. "Chloe Sullivan, I'm a journalist with the Torch." Lionel smiled, clearly interested. "A journalist and a writer. What an interesting pair. I'm sure you two make a great team." Clark kept a polite smile, trying to keep the conversation brief. "We're just enjoying the night, Mr. Luthor." Lionel nodded, but before leaving, he made one last remark. "You know, Clark, I know your father, Jonathan Kent. A man of principles, very different from most people I know. I hope you've inherited that strength from him." "My father wouldn't say the same about you." Clark just nodded, feeling a slight discomfort with the mention of his father. "I try, Mr. Luthor." Lionel smiled, as if satisfied with the response. "I'm glad to hear that. Enjoy your evening, Clark. Chloe." He bid them farewell with a nod and walked away, leaving Clark and Chloe relieved to finally be alone again. Clark sat back down with a sigh. Chloe looked at him curiously. That was strange. Clark smiled at Chloe, trying to lighten the tension. "It's always like that with the Luthors. But now, let's forget about it and enjoy our night." Chloe nodded, still a bit suspicious, but decided to let it go. "You're right. Let's focus on us." As the evening continued, Clark and Chloe enjoyed dinner, with soft music in the background creating a relaxing atmosphere. They talked about light topics, laughing at the little jokes that came up between them. Lex appeared again at their table just before dinner ended. He looked at Clark and Chloe, appearing calmer after Lionel's appearance. "I hope you're enjoying the night. You both deserve it," Lex said, with a sincere smile. "Clark, if you need anything, just let me know. Chloe, it was a pleasure seeing you again." "Thank you, Lex. It's been a wonderful evening," Clark replied, standing up to shake Lex's hand, which he accepted with a smile. "Thank you, Lex. And thanks for everything," Chloe said, smiling and giving a slight nod. Lex nodded, and after saying goodbye, he walked away, leaving Clark and Chloe alone again. Clark turned to Chloe with a calm smile. "I think it's time we go," he said, offering his hand to her. Chloe took Clark's hand, standing up smoothly. "Yes, it's been an eventful night. Let's head back to the hotel and get some rest." They walked out of the restaurant, crossing the hall slowly, as the city lights twinkled in the distance through the large windows. Clark arrived at school with Chloe, both walking through the courtyard as students passed by them. They soon noticed the number of posters plastered on the walls, all with slogans like Clark Kent for class president and vote for Clark. "This must be Pete's doing," said Clark, stopping for a moment as he looked at the posters with a surprised expression. Pete came up behind the two, grinning and enthusiastic. "Hey guys, did you like the posters?" he asked, giving Clark a pat on the back. "You should have warned me before doing this," said Clark, casting a reproachful look at Pete. Chloe chuckled at the situation, but quickly added, "Seriously, Pete, don't you think you should have asked Clark before putting up all these posters?" Pete shrugged, still smiling. "Oh, come on, Chloe. I just wanted to give our friend a boost. He's got what it takes to be a great class president. Everything except the desire to run. Why don't you run for president?" Clark asked, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I'm more of a behind-the-scenes guy, Clark. Besides, think about it, so many girls would want to go out with you if you were president," Pete replied with a laugh. Chloe frowned, clearly annoyed by Pete's comment. "Pete, I'm Clark's girlfriend. I don't think I need to remind you of that," she said, crossing her arms and giving him a serious look. Pete raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Exactly, Chloe. Since Clark's taken, he wouldn't be able to go out with them, which means more for me." Chloe huffed, shaking her head in disapproval. "That's why Jody broke up with you, Pete. You always think in such a ridiculous way." Pete's expression grew more serious, and he raised his voice. "Hey, no need to go that far, Chloe. It was just a joke." "Pete, lower your voice," said Clark, trying to defuse the situation. "Let's keep things calm here. We're all on the same side." Clark sighed and looked directly at Pete. "But I want to make something clear, Pete. I'm not running for president. It's really not for me. I appreciate the thought, but I need you to respect that." Pete looked at Clark for a moment, realizing how serious his friend was. He nodded, finally giving up on the idea. "All right, Clark. I'll respect your decision. Sorry for not asking first." Clark gave a slight smile, patting Pete on the shoulder. "No problem. Let's just move forward, okay?" Chloe nodded as well, seeming satisfied with how the conversation ended. Lex Luthor sped down the road in his silver Ferrari, enjoying the wind against his face as the engine roared. Vroom. Suddenly, he spotted a red Mustang parked on the shoulder, with a woman checking the engine. Curious, Lex slowed down and pulled up beside the car, observing the scene for a moment before opening the door and stepping out. "Car trouble?" Lex asked, with a polite smile as he approached the woman. The woman, still looking under the hood, raised her head and glanced at Lex. "It seems so, but I don't really know much about it." Lex leaned against the side of the car, watching her for a moment. "You seem like you're from Metropolis." She smirked slightly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't look like you're from around here either." Lex raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Mind if I ask your name?" "Carrie. Carrie Castle," she replied, smiling lightly as she adjusted the strand of hair again. "So Carrie, what brings you out here?" Lex asked, keeping the conversation casual. "Just taking some time off. What about you?" Carrie replied, stepping aside as if she wanted a better look at Lex. Lex shrugged, a discreet smile on his lips. "Something similar, I suppose." Carrie kept smiling. "Do you always drive around here? Seems like a bit out of the way for someone like you." Lex's brows furrowed slightly, beginning to notice the barrage of questions. "I like exploring different places." She nodded, keeping her gaze on him. "And this Ferrari? Interesting choice. You must like speed." Lex narrowed his eyes for a moment, scrutinizing her. "You ask a lot of questions, Carrie." She laughed, trying to ease the tension. "Just curious, that's all." Lex then approached her car, opened the door, and got in. He turned the key in the ignition, and the Mustang's engine roared to life. Vroom. Lex stepped out of the car and looked at Carrie, now with a suspicious smile. "Seems like there's nothing wrong with your car, Carrie." Carrie hesitated for a moment, but then gave an embarrassed smile. "You caught me. Maybe I was just trying to get your attention." Lex gave a short laugh, shaking his head. Interesting way to do it, I'll admit. Carrie stepped closer to him, keeping her smile. Maybe you're right. But wouldn't it be nice if we had a more private conversation? Lex observed her for a few seconds, assessing her intentions. Let me guess, you're a journalist, aren't you? Carrie chuckled, raising her hands in surrender. You're good at this, Lex. I work for the Metropolis Journal. I was thinking of doing a profile on you. It would be flattering, I promise. Lex gave an ironic smile, shaking his head. Sorry, Carrie. I'm not interested in being the subject of your next article. Carrie tried to persuade him. Think of the benefits, Lex. It would be a great way to improve your public image. You know people have the wrong impression of you. I could help change that. Lex kept smiling, but his gaze grew colder. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in manipulating my public image through an article. I'd rather let my actions speak for me. Carrie sighed, realizing she wouldn't change his mind. All right, Lex. But if you change your mind, you know where to find me. Lex gave a slight nod, getting back into his Ferrari. Good luck with the Mustang, Carrie. I hope you find another interesting story. He shut the door and sped off down the road, leaving Carrie behind. Vroom. Clark was driving the pickup truck at a relaxed pace, the sky turning orange with the sunset. Smallville seemed calm at that moment, with only a few people on the streets and the fresh evening air filling the atmosphere. He had just dropped Chloe off at her house, and the silence inside the vehicle made him reflect on the events of the day. As the farm appeared on the horizon, Clark saw the wooden house and barn with lights on, indicating that his parents were home. He parked the truck beside the barn, taking a moment to look at the scenery around him. The air was cooler, and the stars were beginning to appear in the sky, scattered like tiny points of light. Suddenly, Clark heard something that made him alert. Michael. With his super hearing, he caught someone saying the name Michael. The sound came from the direction of the storm cellar. Clark frowned, puzzled. Michael? How does someone know that name? He thought, since Michael was the name he had before reincarnating in Smallville. Clark activated his X-ray vision, quickly scanning the house and barn. That's when he saw a figure in the storm cellar, near his Kryptonian spaceship. The person seemed to be investigating the area, rummaging through some things. Clark felt a tightening in his chest, a mixture of concern and anger. Without wasting any time, he moved at super speed, entering the house discreetly and heading down to the storm cellar. Whoosh. His footsteps were silent, and he approached the figure, who had their back turned and appeared unaware of his presence. Finally, you're here, said the figure, turning to face Clark. Clark's eyes widened as he saw who it was. It was himself, only older. Future Clark had a serious and determined expression, his eyes revealing the experience of years of life. Stop calling me Michael, I'm Clark now. And don't you think it's dangerous to come back to the past? Clark asked, still in shock but maintaining a defensive posture. Future Clark gave a weary smile. You didn't think of that when you wished for the Speed Force, did you? I'm here because the timeline has already been altered once, and we need to make sure everything stays on the right path. If I weren't here, things could go very wrong. Clark crossed his arms, trying to stay calm. What exactly is happening? What kind of threat are we facing? Ourselves, replied Future Clark. Don't look so confused. You've been living as if the universe revolves around you, doing whatever you want or whatever you think the Clark from the show should have done. Well, it has consequences. Clark remained silent, processing the words of his future self. He knew he had made choices that diverged from the original story, but he had never considered that it could lead to such big problems. Clark felt a chill run down his spine. So what do I need to do? Clark watched his future self, trying to process everything that was happening. The silence in the cellar seemed to grow heavier as Future Clark kept a steady gaze. I'm going to share some important memories with you, things you need to know ahead of time. Future Clark stepped closer, placing his hand on Clark's head. Clark closed his eyes, feeling a wave of images and emotions flooding his mind. He started to feel a sharp headache, as if his brain were being forced to absorb too much information at once. I'm such an idiot, Clark murmured, still processing the memories that were forming in his mind as the headache throbbed. You're just a teenager who reincarnated in another world and wanted to live life in a fun way. Unfortunately, your version of fun had consequences. For you and for the people you care about, said future Clark, keeping his hand firmly on Clark's head as he transferred the memories. Clark took a deep breath, trying to calm himself amidst the storm of information. The images in his mind showed the future of Lex, the danger that lay ahead, and the choices he would need to make to avoid the worst. The headache persisted, making it hard for him to focus. Am I really going to put Chloe through all this? Clark asked, his voice filled with worry as he pressed his temple, trying to ease the pain. No. I put her through that. You have the chance to do things differently, future Clark replied, his gaze intense. Why didn't you just erase her memories? Clark questioned, confused and trying to ignore the pain. You and I are proof that even death isn't final. Imagine erasing memories, future Clark said, shaking his head. I wanted something genuine, and erasing her memories would destroy any chance of having that with her. Did you ever love her? Clark asked in a low voice, feeling the pain lessen a little. Not in the way she deserved, future Clark replied, looking down for a moment. After other women came into my life, I ended up having many casual relationships, and my connection with Chloe grew more distant. When I suggested the idea of a harem to her, everything fell apart. It was a huge mistake. Clark frowned, absorbing the words of his future self. I don't want that to happen. I want to protect her and make sure she has a happy life, even if it means making tough choices. Future Clark nodded. That's exactly why I'm here. You have the chance to be different, to be better. Use the information I'm giving you, make wiser choices, and never stop valuing those who love you. Clark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility and the lingering headache. I'll do my best not to make the same mistakes. Good, future Clark said, his tone becoming more practical. Now that we've got all the sentimental nonsense out of the way, I need to give you this. What? Clark asked, confused. Future Clark slapped him on the head. Thud. Clark was thrown back, hitting the cellar wall. The headache intensified, throbbing painfully. This is the version 2.0 of the key, future Clark said as Clark stood up, still dizzy. If you mess this up, this whole reincarnation thing was truly a waste. Goodbye. Future Clark turned and disappeared in a blur of speed, leaving Clark alone in the cellar, with his mind filled with new information, a pounding headache, and a sense of urgency he'd never felt before. Calm yourself, Kal-El, a voice echoed in Clark's mind. Clark widened his eyes, surprised by the voice. Who are you? I am the enhanced version of Jor-El, the AI your biological father left to guide you. Unlike before, you have full control over me. Clark sighed, trying to process everything that was happening. The headache seemed to ease a bit with the presence of the voice in his mind. Future Clark is right. If I fail with you, I really am useless. Clark put his hand on his head. He could have at least warned me before putting something in my brain. Scanning host condition. No physical trauma detected. And what about my mental trauma? I just saw my future self and a bunch of terrible memories. Scanning host's mental condition. Sociopathy, megalomania, and narcissism detected. Whatever, everyone has issues. Clark snapped his fingers. Snap. The Kryptonian ship, hidden in the cellar, began to glow brightly, activating its mechanisms. The advanced technology of the ship whirred to life, and in an instant, it teleported, disappearing from the cellar. It'll be safer in the Fortress of Solitude. Clark went back to the farmhouse, where he found Martha in the kitchen. He approached her and gently placed his hand on her belly. Clark kissed Martha on the forehead, lovingly. Mwah. Clark's hand glowed a soft green against Martha's belly. That's my thank you for taking care of me all these years, Clark said, looking tenderly at his mother. Martha frowned, visibly confused. Clark, what did you just do? Clark just smiled, not answering directly. Trust me, Mom. Everything's going to be okay. Martha kept looking at him, uncertain but trusting her son. Clark withdrew his hand, and the green glow slowly faded, leaving only a warm sensation with Martha. She didn't know exactly what had happened, but she felt that something had changed. I'm going out and I won't be home early, so don't wait up. Martha looked at him, concerned. Clark, what are you going to do? Clark gave a calm smile. I have some personal matters to resolve. Clark left the house, leaving Martha with her thoughts as night approached. He then became intangible and invisible. Moving quickly, he used his super speed to scan every corner of Smallville. Every piece of kryptonite he found, he gathered and stored in a secure location. He needed to ensure that all fragments were out of reach. 4 hours, Clark combed through the entire town, going through farms, warehouses, and even residences. He found pieces hidden in unexpected places, including old boxes and even inside abandoned wells. Clark left no stone unturned, determined to cleanse Smallville of this threat. When he was done, he had collected every piece of kryptonite he could find. Clark returned to his tangible and visible state, feeling a bit relieved. Jor-El, what should I do with all these fragments? I advise you to keep some fragments for potential future experiments. Destroy the rest. Kryptonite can be both a threat and a useful tool if used correctly. Clark teleported some of the fragments to the Fortress of Solitude. Then, he used his heat vision to destroy the remaining fragments. Whoosh! The fragments were incinerated, turning to dust and vanishing completely. Clark watched, satisfied that he'd eliminated the threat as Smallville's night grew quieter. Luthor Mansion Lex was already lying down when she arrived. The room was enveloped in a tranquil dimness, with only the soft light of the bedside lamp illuminating the space. Carrie Castle, disguised as a masseuse, entered the room silently. She had an air of confidence, but her eyes showed a cold determination. Carrie began massaging Lex's shoulders, her hands moving with precision. "You feel different," commented Lex, his voice a bit hoarse from fatigue. Carrie smiled slightly, her hands not missing a beat as she massaged him. "Change is a part of life, isn't it? We all change a bit over time," she replied, trying to keep a casual tone. "What are you doing here?" Lex asked, his tone growing more serious. Carrie didn't hesitate. Sometimes a surprise is exactly what we need. Besides, who wouldn't want a relaxing massage after a long day? She kept up her movements, trying to divert Lex's attention. "I'm not giving you an interview," Lex said, his voice now firm and determined. Carrie sighed, realizing she couldn't deceive him any longer. She withdrew her hands from Lex's shoulders and stepped back. "All right, Lex. I won't force you to do anything you don't want to. But know that I came here for a good reason." Lex turned his head, casting a suspicious look at Carrie. "And what exactly is that reason?" Carrie maintained her composure, taking a deep breath before answering. "I wanted to understand who Lex Luthor really is. The real Lex, not the image everyone has of you. I thought this was the only way to do it." Lex stood up from the bed, now facing Carrie. His eyes were cold and calculating. "You lied to get into my house. That's not exactly the best way to earn my trust." Carrie raised her hands, trying to show sincerity. "I know, and I admit it was a mistake. But I believe you have something to say to the world, and I wanted to be the one to tell that story." Lex crossed his arms, evaluating her for a moment. "You want a story? I'll give you a story. But it won't be the one you imagined." Later, at the Talon, Carrie and Lex met again. Carrie was seated at one of the tables, a satisfied smile on her face as she held a draft of the interview. Lex approached, sitting across from her, his eyes studying every detail of the journalist. "So, it looks like you got what you wanted," Lex said, keeping calm, though he knew it could be a problem. "Yes, and I must say it's incredible material," Carrie replied, smiling provocatively. "But it's not exactly flattering, as I promised. It's an exposé of the truth, as you said you wanted." Lex looked at Carrie for a moment, keeping his expression neutral. "I figured something like this might happen. Let me guess, my father put you up to this." Carrie gave a sarcastic smile. "Your father gave me some interesting information, but the truth is, I wanted this story. Something no one else could get." Lex smiled back, leaning across the table. "What if I offered you something better? A position as editor-in-chief of the journal, maybe? That's much more than any exposé could give you." Carrie looked at him for a moment, considering the offer. She knew that a position like that meant power and editorial freedom, something she'd always wanted. After a few seconds, she nodded, smiling calculatedly. "It looks like you've convinced me, Lex. Consider the article buried." Lex nodded, satisfied. "Good. I knew we'd understand each other." Carrie took the draft and slowly tore it to pieces before getting up and leaving the talon, leaving Lex alone with a slight smile on his face. He knew he'd managed to turn a risky situation into an advantage. Roger Nixon arrived at the Luthor mansion, clearly agitated. He walked briskly down the hall to Lex's office, not bothering to knock before entering. "Lex, we need to talk about that deal with Carrie Castle at the Metropolis Inquisitor." Lex, sitting behind his desk, looked up calmly. "Roger, we've already discussed this. The deal was necessary to keep things under control. Carrie was a problem, and now she's resolved." "Resolved?" Roger grumbled, crossing his arms. "Our agreement was that I'd be publishing your stories, not someone else." Lex stood up, walking around the desk. "Roger, I do whatever it takes to protect my interests. You should know that by now. Now, if you have nothing more to say about Carrie, I suggest we move on." Roger took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "Actually, I do have something else. I'm working on a lead about the meteor shower." Lex stopped, intrigued. "Explain." Roger handed over a folder with some files. Lex took the folder and began to leaf through the files, his eyes analyzing every detail. He saw photos, notes, and testimonies. There was something intriguing about what Eddie Cole had reported, and it seemed to coincide with some other reports Lex had heard. "Interesting," Lex said, not looking up from the documents. "I want to hear this story firsthand. Let's go meet him." Roger nodded, and the two left the mansion and headed for the car. They drove to Eddie Cole's house, where the farmer was waiting outside, clearly nervous. "Are you Eddie Cole?" Lex asked, stepping out of the car and approaching the man. "That's me, Mr. Luthor," Eddie replied, shaking Lex's hand with a bit of hesitation. Lex took money from his wallet and handed it to Eddie. "Here's your advance. Now, I want to hear everything you know." Eddie took the money, looking around apprehensively before he started speaking. "I saw a meteor change course during the shower. It was different. It looked like a spaceship. When I went back to take a closer look, it was gone. Someone took it." Lex looked at Roger for a moment before turning his attention back to Eddie. "Are you sure about this? It could have been just an ordinary meteor." "No, Mr. Luthor. I'm sure. I've never seen anything like it. It was something out of this world," Eddie affirmed, his voice filled with conviction. Lex shook his head, visibly skeptical. "Well, thank you for your time, Eddie." Lex turned and started walking back to the car, with Roger close behind. "You heard everything he said, Lex. We've got a hell of a story on our hands," Roger said, trying to convince Lex. Lex stopped for a moment, looking at Roger with a hint of disdain. "A science fiction story, Roger. I don't have time to waste on this. I'm a busy man." Roger persisted, trying to keep up with Lex's fast pace. "Lex, think about it. If there's any truth to this, it could be something monumental, something that could change everything." Lex sighed, not looking back. "Check the details if you want. But until we have something concrete, I'm not wasting any more of my time." He got into the car, shutting the door as Roger stood outside, frustrated but determined to pursue the lead. Roger watched as Lex drove away, determined to continue his investigation on his own. He knew that if there was something there, it would be his chance to show Lex it was worth investing in this story. Clark was sitting at the kitchen table, eating cereal in silence, while Martha washed the dishes. She noticed her son's distant look, his serious expression, and dried her hands on her apron as she approached the table. "Did something happen, Clark? You seem thoughtful." Clark looked up at his mother, hesitating for a moment before replying. "I'm thinking about Chloe. About our relationship." Martha sat down next to him, her expression gentle, filled with concern and motherly care. "Do you want to talk about it?" Clark sighed, putting the spoon down in the bowl. "I really like Chloe, but sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing. She's amazing, but I don't know if I'm the right guy for her." Martha observed him in silence for a moment before speaking, her voice calm and direct. "Clark, when we have doubts about something this important, maybe that's already a sign. Chloe is strong enough to handle a breakup, but what she doesn't deserve is to be deceived. Be honest with her and with yourself." Clark nodded, absorbing his mother's words. "Thank you, Mom. You really helped me." Martha smiled, patting her son's hand. No need to thank me. I'll always be here for you. Now tell me, what did you do when you touched my belly? Clark stared at her for a moment, his thoughts conflicted. I want to tell her that I healed her womb, but I don't want to make a mistake. Even though the womb is healed, there's no guarantee she'll get pregnant. Clark sighed, trying to find the right words. I healed you, Mom. Martha frowned, clearly confused. Clark, what do you mean by that? Clark took a deep breath, deciding. Your womb. You can have children now. Martha looked at him, surprised, but her reaction was serene. You can do that? Clark nodded, a bit uncertain. I can now. Martha smiled, taking his hand gently. Thank you, my son. Clark frowned, confused by his mother's calm reaction. I thought you'd be more excited. Martha smiled again, her eyes full of love. I am happy, Clark. It's always been my dream to be a mother, but you already fulfilled that dream for me. If it happens that I can have another child, I'd be thrilled. But know that you're already enough. Clark nodded, a shy smile on his face. I'm heading to school. Martha watched him as he stood up and left the house, a look of pride and affection in her eyes. Clark parked the truck in front of Chloe's house, turning off the engine. Vroom. He took a deep breath for a moment, looking at the door of the house before finally getting out of the car. He knocked on the door, and soon Chloe appeared, a cheerful smile on her face. Good morning, Clark. Ready to go? Chloe asked, already preparing to get into the truck. Actually, Chloe, I wanted to talk to you first. Clark kept a more serious tone. Can we go inside? Chloe frowned, surprised by Clark's request, but nodded. Of course, come in. She made room for him to enter, closing the door behind him and guiding him to the living room. Clark sat on the couch, still wearing a worried expression, as Chloe watched him, clearly curious. So what's going on, Clark? Chloe, I need to be honest with you about something that's been bothering me for a while. Our relationship. Clark paused, trying to find the right words. I feel like I haven't been fair to you. Chloe frowned, confused. You haven't been fair? What are you talking about, Clark? Chloe, I like you a lot, but only as a friend. Clark spoke with sincerity in his voice. I feel like I can't give you what you deserve in a relationship. And I think it's better if we end things now, before this hurts us more in the future. Chloe was silent for a moment, clearly processing Clark's words. She looked at him, trying to hide the hurt in her eyes. You really don't feel the same about me? I'm so sorry, Chloe. You're amazing, and I want you to be happy. But I realize I'm not the right guy to give you that. I don't want to deceive you or make you wait for something I can't offer. Chloe took a deep breath, trying to keep calm. I understand, Clark. I thought we had something special. Her voice trembled slightly, but she made an effort to keep her composure. We do, Chloe. Our friendship means a lot to me. Clark reached out to touch her hand. I don't want to lose that. I want us to stay friends, as we always have. Chloe looked at their hands before finally nodding. I want that too, Clark. It'll be hard at first, but I think I can handle it. She forced a small smile, though sadness still lingered in her eyes. Clark smiled back, trying to offer comfort. I know I'm asking a lot, but thank you for understanding, Chloe. I really care about you. Chloe lowered her head for a moment, taking a deep breath before looking at him again. Yesterday, I got an internship offer from the Daily Planet, Clark, and I was hoping you'd convince me to stay, but it seems like I should accept it. Clark looked at her, surprised. An internship at the Daily Planet? That's amazing, Chloe. You deserve this opportunity. And even though I'd love for you to stay, I know this is the best for you. Chloe nodded, her eyes starting to glisten with tears. Thank you, Clark. I think this will be good for me, you know? A fresh start. Clark held her hand again, with a sincere smile. It'll be great for you, Chloe. You're talented, and the Daily Planet is lucky to have you there. Chloe smiled, wiping away a tear that escaped. Thank you for always believing in me, Clark. Even though things didn't turn out the way I wanted. I know you care. I'll always care, Chloe. Clark's voice was filled with emotion. I just want you to be happy, and I know you'll find your way. They sat in silence for a moment, just looking at each other, before Chloe stood up. I think it's best we head to school now, right? Clark nodded, standing up as well. Yeah, let's go. And, Chloe, I'm here for whatever you need. Always. Even though we're not together anymore, can you still take me to the spring dance? Chloe asked, a little hesitantly. I wouldn't go with anyone else but you. Clark smiled, trying to lighten the mood. Thank you. When I come back, will you be with someone else, like Lana or that girl who gave you her number at the book signing? Chloe tried to joke, though there was a hint of insecurity in her voice. There's no one, Chloe. Clark looked her in the eyes, sincerely. And no matter who comes along, you'll always be special to me. Chloe smiled, gently touching Clark's arm. Let's go then. School awaits. Clark nodded, and together, they left the house. My mom's right. Chloe is strong and has a scary sixth sense. I'd better not reach out to Zatanna anytime soon, Clark thought as they walked to the truck.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.